Well, I'm in my intellectual spot and I've dressed for the occasion. So, let's talk some more about anti-intellectualism. Cheers. Welcome back everybody to me talking about something slightly book adjacent. If you're new here, usually I talk about books. Today we'll be talking about something that is connected to a conversation about books and other stuff. So I hope you'll enjoy this. Alright, so a couple of weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, whatever, I made a video on why I think that booktubers are incapable of talking about the rise of anti-intellectualism, despite everyone having made a video titled like that. My argument was that since anti-intellectualism is a political problem, we need to frame any discussion about it in political terms, and since large parts of the booktube community are trying to present themselves as apolitical, any conversation is bound to fail simply because we need to frame it in the right way. That video went really well, as videos go, but when I read through the comments and everything, I realized that we still have a lot of confusion when it comes to what anti-intellectualism actually is, where it comes from, and so forth. So I've decided to do the following. I'm going to make 2 more videos, this one and a final video. In this video, I'm going to talk about anti-intellectualism, what it is, and its history in a specifically American context. And in the final video, we'll be talking about what people diagnose as anti-intellectualism in the book sphere, and what it truly is, where it kind of comes from, who's to blame, all of the good stuff. Yes, capitalism will be blamed at some point, don't worry. So that's what we'll do. So today we'll be talking about, well, a brief history of anti-intellectualism in America. Before we move further on, the first part, why in America? See, the conversation is happening in, well, mostly an English language context on BookTube, BookTalk, Bookstagram, whatever. And that part is very much dominated by US and possibly Canadian and, well, British people, and some people like me being, well, German. So this is an American context, for better or worse. That's what being a cultural hegemon means. You run the show, you take the blame. So that's why we need to talk about America in particular. The other part is, of course, how we are going to go through this. See, I'm a booktuber, so I did the thing that booktubers are not supposed to do. I read a bunch of books, and I'm gonna base what I'm going to be talking about on these books. I'll put them down in the description as a bibliography. Largely that is, of course, Richard Hofstadter's Anti-Intellectualism in American Life from 1963. It's an incredibly obnoxiously smug liberal text. Unfortunately, it's also the one that basically is still sort of the standard text for all of this, for better or for worse. So if you want to read something that is really aggravating to read because of the language he uses, but I want to get like an understanding of like the deeper roots of intellectual sentiments in the US, that's kind of the one you have to go through. I also read Empire of Illusions and American Fascists by Chris Hedges, which are more like journalistic approaches to the situation right now. They are much more accessible, I would argue. I also read Susan Jacoby's The American Age of Unreason. It does have some interesting things to say. Unfortunately, it also falls flat in the terrible liberal way, which is being incapable of blaming capitalism while getting this close to actually spelling it out, and then just blaming video and the internet and so forth. So you can learn something from it, but it'll also be very frustrating in that regard. I've also read Matthew Mata's Anti-Scientific Americans, The Prevalence, Origins and Political Implications of Anti-Intellectualism in the US from 2024, so it's a very, very new one. It does unfortunately focus heavily on anti-science aspects, which makes sense in the context, but limits it somewhat to from the larger argument that I am going to make here. There's other books I've read, of course, A Brief History of Neoliberalism by David Harvey. Highly recommend you read that if you want to learn anything about, neoliberalism. Also read Globalists by Quinn Slobodian, which is an alternative narrative on the rise of neoliberalism. I've read books on like Birchers on the John Birch Society, and books like Wild Faith on The Christian Right by Talia Levin. I forgot the author for Birchers, but those are context for where we are going. Now, as you may or may not know, I am blind, which means I don't read a script. This is all improvised. So I may make mistakes. I'm sorry for that. It's just what we'll have to live with. I'm also incapable of, citing, quoting things by heart most of the time. So that's not going to happen. You could just check up these books if you want to know where I'm coming from. There's other books that I've obviously read, but I don't think I can explicitly mention them here, stuff like Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle, or Horkheimer and Adorno's Dialectics of Enlightenment, that kind of stuff. It kind of falls into this, but there's a larger context on this because, we're talking about anti-intellectualism. It's been around for a while. So that's the next part that I wanted to mention. So with all of that out of the way, how is the rest of the video going to go? Well, I've decided to do the following things. First, I'm going to spend some time to define terminology because, as I've mentioned, there's a large amount of confusion on what being anti-intellectual actually means, what anti-intellectualism is, and so forth. And I'm going to define all of those terms that I'm going to be using in that specific way from here on out throughout this video. After that, we'll be going through a number of parts. I will give you a larger argument on how certain strands of anti-intellectualism, or something akin to anti-intellectualism, have been around in American history for the longest time. I'm going to identify 3 of those. One of them is evangelical Christianity, one of them is anti-elitist sentiment, and the third one is the specific American approach to education. They obviously overlap, intersect, and so forth, but these are the 3 main ones, and I'm going to chart their course throughout, American history, US history, to the 20th century, mid of the 20th century, and then I'm going to look at how an alliance of the elite of the capital-owning classes, what you might call the billionaire class, if you want to call it that, made an alliance with Christian fascists and used those 3 strands, wove them into a whip to, whip on the anti-intellectualist frenzy that gave us the place that we are right now, where we dismantle the Department of Education, deny climate change, deny vaccines, and so forth, and have people complaining on YouTube that people on TikTok are reading books about dragons fucking, which is apparently the decline of the West. So that's the larger argument that I'm going to make. So I'm going to spend time for, each of those 3 strands, and then I'm going to look at that history from, say, the 1960s forward to where we are now. After that, we'll hopefully have found, some common, or at least points we can discuss. You can obviously argue against all of these, but at least we know what I'm believing. That is the rough structure. One final thing that I want to say before we move on is I will be talking about anti-intellectualism, but I'll also talk about ability to perform intellectual labor. That sounds complicated. I'm making this very clearly this complicated right now because it's easy to use other words here. And my point is that education is what we need to be able to perform intellectual labor of any form. So this is not something inherent, this is not genetic, there is nothing in that way. It is something that a lack of education, a lack of training, or most commonly a lack of access to education and training has led to a large group of people lacking, the ability to perform intellectual labor. And that's a huge problem. That's the effect of anti-intellectualism. So we need to talk about anti-intellectualism to then figure out what to do about that lack of, ability to perform intellectual labor. And I hope that this video does maybe help some people, or point some people the right direction to find ways to, get better at performing intellectual labor. But that's like the larger argument here, right? With that out of the way, let's talk about terminology. All right. Anti-intellectualism is the distrust and dislike, or the holding of negative attitudes towards intellectuals. That's what anti-intellectualism means. It means disparaging people who are seen as intellectuals, calling them eggheads, pointy heads, all of that kind of stuff. The, cultural Marxist elites and all that stuff. That is anti-intellectualism. Attacking them is anti-intellectualism. Being incapable of deep analysis and formulating our thoughts in, complex words and stuff like that is, as I said, a lack of, lack of ability to perform intellectual labor. Right. Now that we figure out what anti-intellectualism is, we need to figure out what is an intellectual, which is much harder to do than you might think. Now, Richard Hofstadter, who kind of sucks, but he also wrote The Paranoid Style in American Politics, which you should read. It's short, it's really important. ContraPoints quoted it. Go read it. Anyway, he calls an intellectual someone who lives for ideas, or lives a life with ideas. Now, that's incredibly vague. I'm going to go through that step by step, because I want to differentiate intellectual from expert. Now, expert is something that Hofstadter also talks about, because obviously we live in a world that needs experts. Politics need experts because shit's complicated. So I'm going to differentiate those two things, and then I'm going to further differentiate expert from scientist. There's a reason for that. So an expert is someone who has legitimate knowledge and skills that are above what the average person has. That could be, well, mostly academic training, but it could be something else. Less formal training, say. If you're a really good musician, you're an expert player of said instrument. That makes you an expert. If you have a PhD in, say, physics, that makes you an expert by definition. You can obviously go further out and be incredibly granular with that and incredibly specific, but that's what an expert is. Now, experts have the ability to become intellectuals, but they don't have to. Here's an example. Umberto Eco, usually seen as an intellectual. You may know him from the 13 Points of Fascism that everyone on BreadTube has read, but you may also know him from novels like Name of the Rose, or Foucault's Pendulum, or The Prague Cemetery. Or you may know him as someone who generally, is seen as an intellectual, comments on all parts of life and so forth, things that are happening in the world. So, he's an intellectual. He's also an expert, but in what? Well, his PhD was in Thomas Aquinas' aesthetics. That's medieval philosophy or medieval theology. So that is what he's an expert in. He then became a leader in the field of semiotics, a philosophical subdiscipline that was very popular in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So he's an expert in semiotics. But when people talk about Umberto Eco as an intellectual, they are not talking about his expertise in medieval philosophy or in semiotics. They're talking about his ability to present ideas, connect ideas to the present moment, and generally come across as very well-read and smart and so forth. There's a lot of what you might call habitus if you are, an intellectual and read Bourdieu in there. It's about performance of intellectualism in a lot of ways. But you need to have the basics to do that, otherwise you're a pseudo-intellectual. We're not going too deeply into that one, but I think that example makes it clear what the difference between an expert and an intellectual is. Intellectuals are usually experts in at least one or two disciplines, but not all experts are by definition also intellectuals. Ready? Okay, so what's the difference between an expert and a scientist? Now, technically, that's a bit difficult because it depends on your definition of science. I already talked about, being an expert in, playing a specific instrument, being an expert football player, whatever, right? Those are obviously clearly not scientists. When I talk about science in this specific context today, however, I am mostly focusing on the hard sciences. Why? Well, because there is, once again, a difference between what you might call an expert in medieval theology or philosophy versus an expert in meteorology or climate sciences or physics, biology, medicine, those kind of things. We make a sort of difference between what you might call the humanities and what you might call the hard sciences. Fascinatingly, Matthew Motta does count economists as scientists. I would disagree and would call them, much closer to theology, really. But for now, when I talk about scientists, I'm talking about people who are engaging in the scientific method and are usually seen as people who deal in facts and truth and, stuff using proofs and that kind of stuff. We're not engaging in full criticism of science today, but that's the difference between a scientist and an expert for me, for this context. Ready? Perfect. Now we need to make another distinction that I think is vital. And that is between popular anti-intellectualism and authoritarian or top-down anti-intellectualism. There's a big reason here. See, anti-intellectualism, as we said, is the dislike, distrust, attacks on intellectuals. And those can come from the structure of power that we are in, that usually being the state, but that can also come from the regular dude on the street, right? Everyone on the street talking about how they distrust them cultural Marxist professors up there in the universities who have never done like a day's work and don't know what they're talking about. That's popular anti-intellectualism or popular anti-scientism. However, if, say, Joseph Stalin does take all the intellectuals and puts them in a gulag and murders them, that's authoritarian anti-intellectualism. And yes, that's going to be the one time we'll be talking about communists and the left, because the left, in whatever definition you have right now, does not have any institutional power to actually engage in authoritarian anti-intellectualism. It just doesn't. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying and doesn't know what they're talking about. They're not experts in, intellectualism, I guess. But so what we see here is that, and there's an interesting contrast here, because while Stalin's Soviet Union may have been authoritarian anti-intellectuals, that doesn't mean that the average Soviet citizen was an anti-intellectual in any way, shape or form. In fact, the circulation of all those samizdat copies of, say, Bulgakov's Master and Margarita and all kinds of other texts show that there is clearly an appreciation of intellectual work and intellectual labor during that time. Interestingly enough, Stalinist Russia, for example, or Stalinist Soviet Union, was also very much authoritarian anti-scientist. You can look at the example of Lysenko and Lysenkoism, which was when Stalin personally dictated what course science has to take, and that led to a lot of terrible famines in both the Soviet Union and China. That was scrapped once Khrushchev got into power. Now, that wasn't necessarily like perfect intellectual freedom or anything of the sorts, but the realization happened that, you need actual scientists doing science work if you want to, shoot rockets into the sky and all that other stuff. This is important because, once again, while there has been criticism that I didn't mention, say, China's anti-intellectualism and so forth, China's anti-intellectualism is one thing, but China clearly is not anti-scientist. We're putting it aside for the moment that I don't believe that China is a communist country anymore. It is very clearly a neoliberal country that still uses the label communist when it comes to its party, right? But that is an important definition, a distinction between popular and authoritarian anti-intellectualism and anti-scientism. My argument is that authoritarian anti-intellectualism instrumentalizes and weaponizes popular anti-intellectualism to then shift over to anti-scientism, which then, leads to, firing or dismantling the Department of Education, threatening universities with cuts to their budget and funding if they don't do the things that the authority demands, kidnapping scientists and PhD candidates on the streets. All of that kind of stuff is, once again, authoritarian anti-intellectualism, but you need to get there, at least in, say, America. And the way you do that is by, basically breaking education to create the fruitful soil for the rise of anti-intellectualism. And that's where we're going to go now, when we go at those three strands of anti-intellectualism. Do I have good news for you? Because it's time to talk about evangelical Christians. That was my great joke for today. Cheers. Let's talk about strand one of American anti-intellectualism, and that is, of course, evangelical Christianity. So, about 2,000 years ago, last Sunday, a dude rode into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, and 5 days later, they nailed him to a tree. Not for animal cruelty, but for being a general pain in the ass. But you can't keep a good man down, and 3 days later, he came back having redeemed all our sins, and nothing bad has happened ever again. That's roughly what happened. No, of course not. But we need to look at Christianity for a moment before we can get into the specifics of American Christianity. So, for the longest time, there was about one church that figured out what to believe and what not to believe by brawls at councils, burning heretics, all the good stuff. And after a while, it split up into the Eastern Church, now called Orthodox, and the Western Church, now called Catholic. And roughly another 500 years later, people once again figured out that maybe that whole Catholicism thing is not all it's cracked up to be. And we got a bunch of reformations. Obviously, the best one was the Swiss one around Ulrich Zwingli, who, with gang of friends on Good Friday, decided to break the church's weird rules about food by having a sausage party, literally eating sausage in public on Good Friday, which is coming up right now, so now you know what to do. The worst one is, of course, Martin Luther, being a very German pedant, nailing 95 theses to a church door in Wittenberg, and then engaging in long posting wars with the Catholic Church. Anyway, the monopoly on church doctrine in the West was broken around the 16th century. That's kind of what we need to get at. And those are, well, Luther, later on, John Calvin over in Geneva, creating a theocratic dictatorship for a while, and so forth, are the big parts of Protestantism that we kind of have to reckon with. Then there is, of course, another one, which is famously King Henry VIII going to the Pope and telling him, dude, I want to fuck, so please give me a divorce. Pope says no. Henry VIII goes like, well, I guess I have my own church now, and he creates the Anglican Church, still around until today. The fundamental difference that you need to understand, though, is that the Anglican Church, now also called High Church, is basically Catholicism but without the Pope and the King instead. It takes very little differences when it comes to theology. That's a key point that we need to look at, because both Lutheran and Calvinist and Zwinglian and so forth Protestants during the 16th century, they split with the Catholic Church over doctrinal issues. Long debates in theology about specific interpretations and of parts of church law and Bible's texts and so forth are the fundamental basics of their disagreements. The Anglican Church does not have that. Now, what happens is that what with different forms of Protestantism spreading all over Europe, they also reach England. And that leads to a conflict between the Anglican High Church and different, mostly Calvinist groups in the early 17th century that are, well, about one group having very radical ideas about like how to run a church and how to interpret certain parts of theology, and another group going, well, but we're in charge, right? The king is our boss, we're the people. The result is, of course, the English Civil War, which leads to King Charles I getting his head chopped off, which is really good, which also leads to Oliver Cromwell genociding the Irish, which is really bad. And then after a while, everyone goes like, well, can we have our king back, because this whole religious dictatorship doesn't really work out too well for us? And we get the Restoration, and a lot of people who were, pretty radical on the Puritan side of things leave England and move to America. This is where we get our first and big wave of English-speaking Protestant migrants to America, to the United States, which are, the people that found the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they also found, Harvard College, for example. That's the first group, and it's important to understand that these are people who are Calvinist and have a very clear understanding of doctrines. They are well-versed in arguing doctrine and theology. That is the way they engage and distance themselves from other religious groups in a lot of ways. So that's the first big part. But they are also already fiercely democratic up to a point, because the fight between dissenters and the High Church is very much about who has the right to interpret theology. Puritans, I'm using the term right now, although it's obviously a bit more complicated than that, believe that anyone has the right to read the Bible and think about it and talk about it and argue about it, whereas in Catholicism, and up to a point in Anglicanism as well, priests are sort of mediators between God and their flock. It's where the term priestcraft comes from and gets bandied around by a bunch of deists who, you you may have heard of when you've ever heard about, you say, Thomas Paine or Thomas Jefferson or people like that. But we can't go too deeply into all of these elements. My point is that Puritans are the first group that comes to the United States out of, because of political and religious persecution that overlaps. But because so much of their theology is rooted in deep study and learning, they take a lot of that with themselves when they come to the United States. They, as I said, they found Harvard College fairly early on, and they are very much, a lot of them have been educated in the big British universities like Oxford, Cambridge, those kind of things, and they have been obviously educated both in theology but also in philosophy, history, a lot of the general sort of like higher education, and they take all of that and bring that to Harvard College. It is, of course, a theological seminary in a lot of ways, but it also educates people in law and what is generally called a liberal education at the time. They may be very radical and have very clear sort of like limits of what is allowed and what is not allowed. You can look at, people like Anne Hutchinson's being obviously outside the bounds of Puritanism at the time, but they also, as I said, are somewhat, are pretty well educated and have certain tendencies to use that education. Fun aside, famous Puritan and all of that, Cotton Mather, once had his office bombed by someone who was upset that Cotton Mather was, in fact, in favor of, inoculating people against smallpox. So yeah, anti-vaxxer violence goes back a long time. However, what is happening in the British colonies at the time, under both mostly Puritans, and there's different groups of dissenters obviously coming there, is that while they are liberally educated and continue to educate themselves and so forth, they remain mostly close to the coast. And we need to understand that what with an entire continent to be colonized, lots of indigenous people to be genocided, all of that kind of stuff, that leads to a very sort of like narrow group of people that actually have, priests caring for them, preachers caring for them. The further out you get from say Massachusetts Bay and the East Coast at the time, the thinner priests are on the ground. This is one important part. The other part is, of course, that once you start educating yourself and you read philosophy, theology, all of these kind of things, you tend to become somewhat more liberal because you have all these different influences, all these different sources that may somewhat contradict your own worldview, and you kind of deal with all of that, which leads to what you might call the Puritan elite of the new colonies slowly becoming more liberal over time, mostly throughout the 18th century. This is important because at the same time this gives room to some disagreement, partly with their congregations, who are, of course, not all highly educated in Harvard or other continental universities, and also, left to America because of their more radical theologies. And suddenly, their clergy is far more liberal than they are in their own, beliefs. And that leads to a discontent, which opens the door for what you might call awakenings. Great awakenings, the first Great Awakening in this case, which is obviously a first revival of a more fundamentalist, more direct form of religion. In this case, it's Methodists and groups like that that move from Britain to the US, and the key understanding that I really need to hammer home here is that these, being evangelical Christians, focus on the good news. That's what Evangelion actually means, which means very much on the Bible alone, on the story of the good news of being born again after having been told mostly just the Gospels and nothing else, and believing in God and Jesus and feeling that you are saved. They emphasize a direct connection to God, whereas those Puritans, and before them Catholics and so forth, are arguing theology on fairly obscure terms. They are looking at what it means to live a good life beyond, that, but they are not focusing on that direct connection. That is an important difference that we need to keep paying attention to for throughout the rest of this specific strand of anti-intellectualism. So throughout the 18th century, we have our first Great Awakening. We have all the ideas of like religious enthusiasm and people speaking in tongues, people rolling on the ground, all of that good stuff that you've heard from, like, revivalist churches and so forth. And they obviously speak partly to said, somewhat disappointed, more radical believers who are annoyed by the fact that their clergy has become liberal. They have wimped out, and that's certainly where they recruit a lot of people. But they also do something that the Puritan elite, so to speak, did not do at the time. They move, in fact, into the inner parts of the country. They move to the borders of the Western white settlements and the colonial efforts in the United States, where they talk to as like circuit preachers, riding from homestead to homestead to homestead, preaching the good words to these people who have like basically no education, because planting corn and genociding natives is in fact hard work and leaves very little time for study. And that means that they are, on the one hand, often without any religious beliefs, and therefore, according to these evangelical preachers, and we need to take them seriously for now, very much in need of saving. This is, I can't emphasize this enough. These are sincere believers at this time, and we need to take that seriously. Saving souls is important, because if you can't save a soul, it will burn in hell, and that's pretty bad. St. Augustine has written about that if you really want to look into it. But for now, I think we understand where we are. So these evangelical Christians, Christian sects like Methodists, later on Baptists and so forth, spread away from the East Coast, the fairly densely settled, well-educated parts of the East Coast, further to the south and further to the west, and spread their specific brand of religion there. They use very simple stories, they use very simple messages. It's that good old fire and brimstone, and also very narrative approaches to theology. That's something that happens first during the First Great Awakening during the 18th century, and then once again during the 1820s, 1830s, the Second Great Awakening, which also gives us, people like Joseph Smith and Mormonism, which, Joseph Smith goes into the forest, preaches, and, prays to God to ask which is the correct denomination, and gets an answer from God directly, going like, well, none of them. Clearly, you got to do your own. I'm simplifying here, but Smith is not alone in that, and that is that fundamental evangelical understanding of that perfect, personal connection to God that a lot of these groups have. And there are arguments that Mormonism in particular has a very narrative approach to theology. I will talk about more about that in like a very different video. Anyway, where are we? We have that first split between a well-educated Puritan, Presbyterian, and so forth clergy, different denominations, of course, on the East Coast, that has Bible colleges that have become some of, what we now call as a Ivy League universities. And then we have groups that are very hands-on, going out there into the wilderness, preaching to every single person they can find, trying to save souls and spread the good word using a very different language and approach. And you can see how that can lead to certain, conflicts, and something where a distrust of elites, of those intellectual preachers over there on the East Coast, can sort of like spread there and creep in. And in fact, it does. Obviously, a lot of these groups, Methodists, Baptists, and so forth, over time also develop, school systems, education systems to educate, further educate, and create a sort of clergy, a form of elite in that regard. That's just like how these structures work in general, but it takes much longer, and that specific sort of distrust, that anti-elitism, and we'll go to that later, creeps into religion at the time. All right, now we need to talk about a phenomenon of the 19th century, mostly after the Civil War, and that is what you might call evangelists, revivalists, the people that turn into our big-time televangelists and so forth in the 20th century. We always, with these individual preachers going from place to place, preaching, saving souls, these become almost superstars in a way. They draw large crowds that want to see that one specific guy preach once, want to see Finney preach once, want to see Whitfield preach once, and a lot of this is very much about their personal charisma, their personal approach to doing this. They become showmen in a way, in a lot of ways. Obviously entertaining, because there's nothing much more than watching your cornfield and killing natives. So what you're going to do? Watch the local Methodist in a lot of ways, right? So we have this element, and that fame is obviously tied to what they are achieving, how large their crowds are, how many people convert after hearing them preach, and so forth. And that is something that we can see already settle in. It gets much more radical after the Civil War, with people like Dwight L. Moody being sort of like the first big one in that regard, preaching in England, preaching in the US, getting support from businessmen, business elites, also spreading their evangelizing efforts back from the countryside into the cities, because at that point, with migration being up, with lots of people from other parts of Europe moving to New York, moving to Chicago, moving to Boston, moving to all these places, all these migrants need proselytizing. Labor industrialization has kicked in. You have a new group that needs preaching and saving. So we start having these large revivalist meetings, not in the countryside, but in large cities. And they become, once again, big entertainments, big shows. Moody talking in front of thousands of people and running this very much like a businessman, which he was before he turned preacher. And from there, you slowly move to people that, like, this escalates. And the next big step there is obviously someone like Billy Sunday, who was a professional baseball player before he became an evangelist. And he is a much more aggressive evangelist. This dovetails with the later 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, where you have a first larger crisis of masculinity in America. And Billy Sunday is very much, he's strong, he's a former athlete, he talks about a very masculine form of Christianity, about how Jesus was not a wimp, but in fact could whip anyone and be violent and so forth. Keep in mind, this is 19th century. This will come back to haunt us all the way to now. This is sort of the early 20th century. Obviously, these are people that are, have always had successes to today. But this is something that happens during the end of the 19th and early 20th century, which is obviously also when modernization does creep in. Theology, even Protestant theology, has to wrestle with things like higher criticism, which is a German thing. The early 20th century being, World War I is where anything that comes from Germany is already suspect, and I personally would never trust anything that comes from Germany, so don't trust me. All of these things come in. What happens is that a fundamentalist evangelical movement that has based all its faith on, the Bible and not much else, and direct connection to God, is not necessarily well equipped to understanding a world that is getting more and more complex, that requires understandings of sciences, of educational things like, evolution and so forth, which obviously some people get more education. Education becomes more important during that time, even if you want to, get jobs in offices and so forth. And what you have is a split that always occurs in these situations. Some people just modernize, liberalize, educate themselves and move on and find ways to square things like, the findings of the sciences with their faith. There's a lot of evangelical Christians out there who are not fundamentalists. But there's also a group that retreats from that, and they move further and further away. They radicalize themselves. These are the people the people that believe that Jesus is very masculine and just beats everyone who is against him and all of that kind of stuff. And that leads to one big thing, that being the Scopes trial. The Scopes trial happens in the 1920s, and it is about evolution. It's in fact about a school biology book that was already used in Tennessee for almost a decade before this became an actual case. And then a teacher was sued for teaching evolution. And what happened is, of course, evangelicals lost that case, and they were ridiculed for their very backwards ideas and so forth. It did not go well for them at the time, but it shows a lot of understandings, what with a lot of schools being paid for directly by the people living around that specific school. We talk about education systems later. What with people growing up in the 19th century and still holding to a very fundamentalist belief, having to reckon with the fact that their children are being taught things that may differ from what they believe, and how to deal with that. And it showcases ideas that, whoever pays the teacher has the right to decide what that teacher gets to teach their children. These are things that are talked about and argued during the Scopes trial and the environment around that. This is important to understand because the Scopes trial going wrong pushes a lot of these people further into radicalization Unfortunately, that's where they have stayed ever since, but it showcases ideas that we see in education systems today. So this is roughly where we are with that specific part of anti-intellectualism. It comes in several waves. It starts out with a sort of conflict between Puritan elites that get themselves educated further and further, and the necessities of preaching and proselytizing to individuals in a very thinly settled United States. It then switches over to the personal magnetism and the way we value or judge individual preachers by the numbers they have of souls they have saved, of people they have converted, turning that into an industry, turning it into a business that is very much tied to numbers and things like that. And in conflict with modernity leads to a split between more moderate evangelicals and a more radical group that moves further to the political right in a lot of ways. And all of this, culminates in the Scopes trial, where the more radical group suffers a defeat. But they'll learn from that defeat, and that's why I wanted to bring that specific part up. Obviously, what happens next is, the Great Depression and all of that stuff, which focuses and shifts from the radical religious discussions further into like economics and stuff like that. But at that point, the radical fundamentalist evangelical church has already created a parallel reality, and we'll keep that in mind for where we have to go later on. Yeah, that's what I had to tell you about the first strand of evangelical Christianity, of anti-intellectualism in the US. The next part builds on that, which is when we talk about anti-elitism and how that fits into that. We have seen parts of it already. These obviously overlap, but the next one will be focusing on that specific aspect. I guess we can all agree that we hate the elites. So let's figure out who they really are. Cheers. Welcome to Strand 2, Anti-Elitism in America. Alright, so we will talk about the anti-elitist aspect of anti-intellectualism in American history. And before we can go there, we need to do the thing that we always do, which is look at some of the words and then do some theory, because clearly this is not an intellectual video, right? So, what are elites? Now, that's kind of difficult to work through, right? Because while we all have an idea whom we mean when we say elite, that's not necessarily the same thing as what an elite is. See, if we assume that the elite, an elite group is a group that is better than everyone else in a specific field, that means that, of course, intellectuals, at least if they have, say, academic degrees, academic education and so forth, are clearly an elite when it comes to education. On the other hand, when we mean people with, say, power or people with lots of money, then turns out having a PhD in astrophysics will probably not actually put you into what you might call the elites. So clearly there is a casual definition of elite, and there is a specific definition of what an elite is in a specific field, and so forth. And it is that casual definition of those who are better than us, those who have more power, money, knowledge, whatever, than me, the regular folk, that we kind of dislike. Obviously, because if they have, more of something than I have, than most people have, then that means they have agency that we don't have, and having a lack of agency, having a lack of control of our circumstances is something that we all kind of hate. So that's sort of where anti-elitism often comes from, and it has been around, I guess, from whenever we started having any form of hierarchies in any form of society. Whenever one person had more mammoths than any other person, then we hated that mammoth breeder elite, right? But that's kind of where we are at with that casual definition of elite. But I think the other part that I just mentioned is important, that we have obviously elites in specific areas, and that is just how things are, because someone who has more training in a specific field will be the elite in that specific field. Someone who has more money than everyone else is part of the financial elite. Someone who knows more people, or someone who has, I don't know, more jobs, more titles, whatever, will be part of a specific elite. That is just like how things are. So what we want to do now is look at a bit of theory before we can move into the history part of this thing. And that is, we need to talk about capital. But hold your horses, this is not where we do Marx. This is in fact far worse. This is where we do French theory. This is where we do Pierre Bourdieu and talk about different forms of capital, which is in fact the title of an essay that you could read if you want to learn more about this. So what do I mean when I talk about different forms of capital? Well, basically, and this is the roughest approach to this that I can do right now, there are different, Bourdieu and other people have accepted that there are different forms of capital. Capital being something that we have, and that we can use to, get ahead in life for whatever reasons and so forth. That is what we call capital. Now we can split that up, and Bourdieu does that, and I think it's helpful for the story that I'm trying to tell here, into three basic parts, and then there's a fourth one. Those three are cultural capital, social capital, and economic capital. The fourth one is symbolic capital, and it's a bit more difficult to achieve. So what do we mean by that? Cultural capital basically is what you know. Social capital is who you know. And economic capital is what you own. That's roughly what it is. Whereas each of these forms of capital can allow you to accrue symbolic capital that will get you more respect and so forth in society. Say, if you have a PhD, that does give you, or used to give you, a certain form of symbolic capital beyond anything else. But obviously it means you have accrued a lot of academic capital by, cultural capital by going to university and studying and doing all of the hard work. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you have much more cultural capital than someone who just has an MA in your specific field and then did lots of lab work and all kinds of stuff, right? That's not necessarily what it is, but the title PhD does give you certain levels of respect, at least in some groups and fields and so forth. That's just like how titles work. If you are a veteran, for example, at least not in Germany, like our, say, World War II veterans don't necessarily have a lot of symbolic capital because they're veterans. But if you're a veteran in the US, you have symbolic capital. Everyone with their I'm a veteran on so forth sticker on their pickup trucks and so forth, they try to sort of display that form of symbolic capital of being a veteran. And obviously there are other forms of, like, having lots of money allows you to own certain things that tell everyone that you are better than them. That's sort of how this kind of works in a lot of ways. So the important thing to know is that you can transform one form of capital into another up to a point. For example, if you have enough cultural capital, you can bargain that into economic capital by, having a certain degree, having a certain education and so forth, and that allows you to get a specific kind of job and you get money for that. That's how you bargain your cultural capital into social capital, into economic capital. If you have economic capital, that allows you to meet all kinds of people that you don't necessarily know otherwise. That allows you to transform your economic capital into social capital. Obviously, this works the other way around. If you know lots of people, that will probably make it easier for you to get the kind of jobs that can, give you more money. So you can transform one form of capital into another. So to sum this all up, cultural capital is, the stuff the way the things your education, the language you speak, and so forth. Social capital is, the social network that you have, people that if you are part of, like, a sports association, if you're part of a church, if you are part of a labor union, all of these kind of things are forms of social capital. The kind of people you can call upon if you need something, basically. That's roughly. But once again, this is the simplest version I can come up with here right now. And my economic capital is, simply money. The stuff you own, basically. Now, where I want to go with this is, and we can go back into, say, habitus, which is how you, up to a point, use these forms of capital, specifically cultural capital, to signal that you are part of a specific class within the social system, right? If you have a lot of cultural capital, you know a lot of stuff. You've been to the opera. You can talk about classical music and philosophy and so forth. That signals that you are obviously, up to a point, a very well-educated person in that and so forth. On the other hand, if you know lots about football and whatnot, that once again is part of a specific form of habitus. And those are we talked about that when we talked about Umberto Eco. Those are significant when it comes to having an image of an elite, for example, right? So here's where we slowly inch over into history. My argument is that a society does usually value one form of capital over other forms of capital when it comes to generally how we think about ourselves and stuff like that. That can change over time. Obviously, when such a shift happens, the, say, elite of that new capital that is now what we might call dominant or most appreciated and so forth, needs to distance itself from the sort of elites or the holders of previously most popular types of capital, right? That's something that we see, and this is the story that I try to tell you today when we talk about anti-elitism in America. So, let's get started, shall we? I already mentioned that in our previous strand, that even with the Puritans and thus the first, what you might call cultural elite, and elite in the beginning colonies and then United States, they are already part of such a conversation, and they are anti-elitist in a form, because the struggle with the Anglican High Church is a struggle about who has authority, and through that authority is seen as the elite, right? The clergy of the Anglican Church is clearly the clerical elite within England in the 17th century, simply by how that church is organized, and by challenging that authority, challenging that elite, Puritans are in a way distancing themselves from that Anglican Church. And they're doing that partly by accruing and accumulating cultural capital. We talked about that. They are often incredibly well educated, and once they arrive in America, they start founding a lot of universities at the the East Coast. They start Harvard. They found a lot of these classic, what you now call Ivy League schools. So clearly the accumulation and up to a point display of cultural capital is one way. The first elite within the United States is, that's what they transfer, their cultural capital, they transfer that into their symbolic capital, and that's how they establish their status as an elite. By being an elite, obviously they also accrue a lot of the other capital, right? If you're the smartest people in New England, you probably also know a lot of people, and a lot of people know you. That's how you accrue your social capital. It means that you get lots of business opportunities, and that's how you accrue your economic capital. So that's where we have our first step in American history that I want to look at, is under the Puritans throughout the 18th century mostly as well. We have the United States as a place where cultural capital is very much the top capital, and the owners, the cultural elites, are the overall elites of the state. This does shift. Now, there's a bunch of reasons for why that shifts. One of them is, once again, the fact that North America at the time is in the process of being colonized. And while these elites cluster on the East Coast, which is, where all the trade comes in, where all the universities are and so forth, people that move away from that automatically lose access to certain forms of capital, right? If you are out there somewhere in the West, in Ohio, and you're murdering indigenous people, you don't have access to the opera. You can't go to fucking Harvard. You're busy surviving, and everything is miles and miles and miles of diarrhea-ridden, walking through the frost-bitten snow away from where culture happens. So what we see is, through this historic process, not for anything else, is that the further away you get from the coast, from the East Coast, where cultural elites are the American elites, the further away you get from that, the less power, the less symbolic capital is connected to that cultural capital that the elites have. Cultural elites are slowly losing their dominant position within American society. That's the first step. Now the question is, where do we move from here? And my argument is that we slowly move to a dominance of social capital, away from cultural capital. And the way we can see that is through religion, partly, and also other things, right? So it starts out with religion through those awakenings, right? We have social networks that are around different congregations. Some of them are more obscure sects. Some of them are just, one Methodist circuit rider going from place to place to place. But people are defining themselves through that. That is one way how, say, social capital begins to overshadow and slowly replace cultural capital as the dominant sort of way that elites are defined. It's an ongoing process. An elite by now is you're not necessarily seen as the social elite if you are a preacher or if you're part of like a congregation, but it's something you can use to slowly convert into a status as an elite. And this is where we slowly move away into the realm of politics. See, we have our founding fathers. All of them are cultural elites. Obviously, they're also very fucking rich, but a lot of them are university educated. And what's more, a lot of them also, except for, say, George Washington and Ben Franklin, were partly university educated in Europe, in different parts of Europe, in Oxford, in Cambridge, in Leiden in the Netherlands, in all of these places. They are still very much the cultural elite at that time. This slowly shifts throughout the first half of the 19th century, and obviously the key sort of like turning point there is Andrew Jackson and the Jacksonians and what happens around that time. And it's a very deliberate sort of like stepping away and distancing from those cultural elites. It's about being simple, being, the whole log cabin and hard cider campaign, the idea of being of good sense, common stock, being able to have like action and fighting and all of that, and knowing your people, being frontier people versus people on the East Coast who are seen as frankly too well educated. It's that kind of conversation that you have with people like John Quincy Adams, who wanted to have like a university built in Washington, which is something no one wanted to spend money on. And that is how we slowly move further away and distance ourselves from cultural capital. And the people in power and the form of the display that gets you into power and gets you certain dominance in a lot of ways is by actively distancing yourself and disparaging the holders of cultural capital. It's interesting, for example, that we have someone like Davy Crockett is a member of Congress at some point and is very explicitly talking about how he has no education and nothing else and so forth. And he's so powerful through that display of anti-elitism, of anti-intellectualism, of anything like that, and more talking about his connections to all his settler friends and squatter friends out there in fucking Tennessee and wherever, that he is so valuable that the Democrats lure him away from Andrew Jackson and so forth to regain a form of power within that wonderful, more or less, two-party kind of system. That's also the time where you have the Know-Nothing Party. We can't go too deeply into the Know-Nothing Party. It really hates Freemasons and a lot of other things. It's racist as fuck and so forth. But this is the time where flaunting your ignorance and flaunting your lack of cultural refinement is seen as standing up against an elite, while also the way to maneuver yourself into the upcoming elite. Interestingly enough, at that point, having a lot of economic capital is not yet seen as a sign of, worth in a lot of ways. For example, there's a 15-page pamphlet accusing President Martin Van Buren of having installed bathtubs in the White House and being, displaying way too much wealth and being a snobby, nouveau riche kind of guy. Imagine someone would do that right now, right? Anyway, so we have a slow shift towards social networks. This is important. The next step throughout this is, of course, the beginning of machine politics, right? The center of gravity, the political center of gravity, has slowly shifted away from the East Coast, from the coast, towards the west, towards the colonial frontier and places like that throughout the 19th century. But this is slowly going to change again with the East Coast and the rise of industrialization, the rise of immigration from different parts of Europe. This is where we come to the next important part of social capital. We're going to talk about machine politics. See, with the rise of industrialization in America, a lot of migrants from Europe come over. They are poor, they're looking for jobs, they get, drawn into all these wonderfully terrible jobs that you remember from your reading of Karl Marx's first volume of Capital and all the, and your Charles Dickens and so forth. A lot of them don't necessarily speak English as their first language. A lot of them are, bring their own social networks back home with them. This is the time of, the very much genocidal Great Hunger in Ireland, where England decides to absolutely not support, the Ireland during the potato plague and so forth. This is where people from Eastern Europe, from Germany, move over, and they arrive in places like New York and so forth, and they find social networks of their country people, of their co-religionists, when we're talking about the Catholic Church, for example, there, and we find the machine, which is a system of, organizing power, staying in power, organizing votes for specific political parties, and in exchange, organizing jobs, solving social problems, integrating integrating these newcomers and so forth. It's a form of social support, and that's roughly where this goes. A really good book that I highly recommend you read on this is, of course, Terry Galway's Machine Made Tammany Hall and the Creation of Modern American Politics. And I'm certainly relying on that for parts of this. So this is another form of where social capital is how politics are dominated in American politics during the mid 19th century all the way to the end of the 19th century, roughly. But this is obviously not the end. We are slowly moving over to the dominance of economic capital, but we need to move slowly there. There are two important things that we need to look at. One of them is that during the 19th century, the US is slowly trying to develop an American identity. And it does that, of course, in distancing itself from Europe and in setting up an American identity in contrast to a European identity. Now, what we have already seen is, of course, that the European identity is, in a lot of ways, has a relatively well-balanced, or used to have a relatively well-balanced sort of dynamic between different forms of capital, and especially education and cultural capital are seen as very, very important in that European identity. Whether that's true or not is obviously a different question, but it's certainly how it seems. Elite universities like Oxford and Cambridge, but also universities in the Netherlands and in particular in Germany during the 19th century are where everyone goes if they want to get the best fucking education and thus the most important cultural capital that you can get. The same goes for art, right? Literature, art. You go to fucking Italy and look at all the beautiful Roman statues. You go to France and read all the good books. You do all of these things. So cultural capital and cultural elitism is something that is seen as a fundamentally European identity. And that means that while America is slowly moving, American society is slowly moving over to first social capital and then slowly to economic capital, it is also developing its own identity as an American identity in contrast and in distancing itself from that cultural capital and the cultural elitism of Europe in a lot of ways, which means that, people that you can see as intellectuals and the cultural elites of America have a hard time because they're seen as somewhat more European. Now, what is interesting is that specific form of identity also once again starts around, say, the mid-19th century, around Jackson, around that, is very much tied to both Manifest Destiny, the settler, genocider sort of identity of the man of action. Man is very important here, right? People that go out and fight all day, then drink way too much whiskey, and then go home and make a new state and don't think too much, because what it really comes down to is willpower and possibly maybe character, which is usually defined as mostly willpower and maybe a bit of religion depending on where you are. At the same time, you have the rise of what you might call temperance movements, which are usually seen as women-dominated. So this is already slightly gendered. Which leads to something that we see all the way to basically today, where being the cultural elite, being seen as an intellectual, being seen as a European, is being seen as effeminate. There's a lot of homophobia and so forth baked into that, and it has persisted all the way until today, right? Being a man of action, being a true American means going out there doing dumb shit with your body, being incredibly masculine, not thinking too much about it, not wasting all your time on education and all these womanly things. That's part of where this American education, American identity is built, in contrast to being an intellectual, in contrast to accruing cultural capital and becoming a cultural elite. And this is something that obviously moves over from the social capital parts of, say, machine politics, where a lot of this is dealing with people that are incredibly poor in all forms of capital, being barely educated, having no money whatsoever, being poor and downtrodden and abused and exploited by, the owners of mostly economic capital, sort of integrating them into a society, doing all that hard labor of actually, integrating them into a society is handled there. So there is certainly a point where this sort of like dismissing or certainly giving less value to cultural capital makes a lot of sense at the time. Now, this is unfortunately where we slowly shift over to economic capital. Because one thing that happens during the mostly second half after the Civil War, during the Civil War and mostly after the Civil War, is of course the rise of industrial capital in America. We have railroads, we have all kinds of industry, and we have what we know as robber barons, your Vanderbilts and so forth. That ilk, your Leland Stanfords, and a lot of these are obviously people that accrue an insane amount of money, and thus an insane amount of economic capital, which they can use to, create social capital, and thus slowly sort of shift over the overall dominance from the sort of like holders of social capital towards the holders of economic capital. It's where a lot of like labor struggles, which you can see basically as a struggle between the forces of social capital and the holders of economic capital, is happening during that time, moving all the way into the 20th century. It's also the time where one thing happens that is also very much key of that American identity. It is, in fact, the victory of individualism. Obviously, social capital and being a pure individual is not necessarily going to work really well, and cultural capital and being a pure individual that gives a fuck about anyone is also not going to well, because that's not how education works. But going out there and cheating everyone out of their money and then lording it over everyone else works mostly if you are an individual person. And that is the next part that we can see in this shift of capital over. Because if everyone is responsible for themselves, it means you're not responsible for anyone else. It also means that you need to look at what made these people very rich. Clearly, it's not education and cultural capital. It certainly was, the willingness to cheat, trick, and be ruthless as fuck. But it also means that everyone else who does not own cultural capital can believe, and this is the birth of the American dream, can believe that they have the force, they have the chance to also become part of the elite and join that specific elite, which doesn't want to be seen as an elite, because no one wants to be seen as the elite. We already established that there is that sort of casual anti-elitism. So what we see is a shift towards willpower, action, force, which is often tied together as this package of character, which we see in self-help books. People are writing biographies, autobiographies of all these robber barons, and most of them are not very educated. A lot of them accrue cultural, symbolic capital by buying lots of artworks, endowing different funds, paying intellectuals, paying other people to accrue sort of that glimmer of symbolic capital that obviously parts of cultural capital can give you, but it's very much that shift that is important. And by sort of the final battle in a lot of ways between the social capital on the one hand, the labor forces, and the owners of economic capital, is something that kind of coincides with sort of the loss of sort of dominance of the evangelical temporary loss of dominance of evangelical Christianity and fundamentalists during the first decades of the 20th century. It's the time of like massive labor struggles, right? It's the time of the Battle of Blair Mountain. It's the time of so many labor struggles being absolutely brutally gunned down by people in, positions of power, and power in this case meaning the elite, the economic elite. And at the same time, it is also the sort of like the last sort of gasp of social capital. It happens, for example, in, say, New York City, where Tammany Hall is slowly moving into, say, social progressive politics, with someone like Al Smith establishing certain elements of, precursors to what we see during the 1930s and the New Deal. This is the struggle that defines a lot of these last kind of years. What's interesting is that progressives and reformers during that time don't necessarily have a good reputation, because in a lot of ways, they are seen already as sort of proponents of that cultural elite. They are seen as somewhat European, and a lot of them are Europe educated. Even fucking Robert Moses, who you may know from Robert Caro's Power Broker, the guy who fucked up New York. He actually wrote his thesis about the British civil service, and he studied partly in Oxford. So what you see is that by trying to actually achieve goals in, say, social reform, those progressive forces, the holders of social capital, need to further distance themselves from the cultural capital that is sort of connected to, say, intellectualism and so forth, to combat the forces of economic capital. This obviously never goes well if you sort of push someone under the bus to maybe get something out of it, but it's kind of what happens. And it seems partly that this works and partly that it doesn't, and Al Smith does not become president in the 1920s. Herbert fucking Hoover becomes. Here's a tip: never trust anyone named Hoover. They're all bad guys and they fuck up the world. But yeah, and then the Great Depression. And for a short time, it seems that the absolutely dominant force that had crushed the owners of social capital during, say, Prohibition and so forth, the crushing of Tammany Hall, the crushing of all the machines, through sheer willpower and being the good guys and having moral character, and we talk about that later on, and having all the money, seemed to fail, and FDR comes into power, and maybe social reform is happening. Maybe there will even be sort of like experts, people that know stuff, intellectuals, holders of the cultural elite will maybe get a modicum of respect for a while. And just like as we have seen with evangelical fundamentalists, the holders of the economic elites are not going to take this lying down. They are going to do their best to get back at, everyone, and reestablish their status as the elite. How are they going to do that? Well, we need to wait until we have talked about the third strand of anti-intellectualism in America, which is, of course, education, which we'll do next. Few things say education like day drinking, so let's talk about it. Cheers. Alright, let's talk about strand number 3 of the rise of anti-intellectualism, and that is, of course, the American education system. Now, before we move further into this, and this is also going to go until, like, say, 1930-ish, before we move into the final part. But before we move further, I need to explain that I am not an expert in education. I have not studied education. In fact, I started a teaching degree, and after like one semester decided that I hate kids, I'm not going to do that. So take this with a grain of salt. Also, it is important to understand that the science of education is constantly moving forward and is probably one of the most debated and most argued about things you can study these days. There are so many opinions, and experimenting on our youth is one of the proudest traditions of humanity in general, I would argue. So there's a lot of stuff in here that can't necessarily be blamed on, one specific person, bad ideas or whatever. It's just part of trying to figure shit out without like really strict ways of doing that. Anyway, beyond that, before we move into the history part, we need to do some more definitions and stuff. And this time I would argue there are two main sort of pairs of definitions that we need to look at. The first part for this that I want to look at is in the term education, because that's a very interesting thing to me when it comes to language. See, education can mean a lot of different things, and I, as a German, had to figure out how to deal with that, because in German we have two different words that are part of this term. So we have Erziehung, which is much closer to what you might call pedagogy. It's about talking about teaching behavior, teaching maybe morals, teaching how to act in society, how to interact with society and so forth. It's the part of education that is, that builds character, that educates your character. And then we have Bildung. Bildung meaning the part that is, teaching knowledge, training knowledge. It's the skill part of education. And I think it's important to have that sort of dichotomy, that those two terms, because a lot of education discussion, I think, especially in an English language context, comes from having those two aspects of what we call education sort of overlap and fall together and sometimes collapse, and that leads to a lot of confusion, and that confusion can be exploited. So that's the first kind of thing I want to talk about here. I will talk about pedagogy when I talk about, creating character. And I will talk about schooling when I talk about, imbuing skills and that kind of stuff, knowledge. So that's the first part that I want to look at. And then there is a second one, and that is about, the technique of education, right? And once again, I think there are two different ways of doing that, and it's important to understand the difference there. This will come back later, so make notes, right? And that is the difference between training and teaching, because those are two different things. So what do I mean when I say training? Training is very clearly giving someone the skills or the knowledge of how to do a specific thing. That's one form of knowledge if you go into, say, the philosophy of, into theoretical philosophy. Knowing how to do a specific thing is very different from knowing something, right? So training is, the kind of stuff you might learn in an apprenticeship. You learn how to become a carpenter before they nail you to a cross, right? That's one way of describing it. And training is something that we all need when we want to perform specific tasks. Teaching, on the other hand, versus training, is more concerned with, imbuing knowledge or giving knowledge of what things are. Giving knowledge, imbuing knowledge, basically. So it's more about the knowledge of what it is, what it could be, the truth, facts, that kind of stuff. It's much closer to how we imagine school is. You go to history class, up to a point you'll learn how to, do history things, how to read history books, how to think about history. That kind of stuff is what I would call teaching. And depending on which part of, say, the education system you're in, training or teaching will be more important, and once again, not differentiating between those two things makes it very easy to abuse the larger education system. So I will look at how the broader American education system shifted from a, say, prevalence or an emphasis on training or teaching to the other and forth and back. That's kind of the goal here. So, got all of that? Perfect. Then let's look at the history, shall we? So, before we get deeper into that, I want to explain one further thing, and that is the United States of America, you may be aware of, is, on the one hand, it's United States, so there's a bunch of them, and the other part is, of course, it's a huge fucking country, right? It's very big, and that means, depending on where and when you are in the United States, the expectations and the needs that an education system has to fulfill are different. Obviously, right? And that is why when we go through this, I will also go through this not just in chronological and historical order, but I will also jump around from place to place to explain how the regional differences impacted the way the United States have done their educationing. Mostly it's gone poorly, but it's gone poorly in different ways, and that I think is important to understand. So let's start once again with the East Coast and the 17th, but mostly 18th century, shall we? And as we have already established, that is where the Puritan elites are a intellectual elite, are an elite that is very much tied to knowledge, that is very much tied to the dominance of cultural capital, all of those wonderful things, right? So what we see in education there is, of course, the founding of Harvard College, later of Princeton, all of these massive colleges and universities that have a very, very good reputation all the way to today, right? They are the Ivy League colleges, you know that. What is interesting to see here is that when we look at how that education system works at the time, it is very much about teaching, and it's very much about what we might call schooling. And what is interesting there is that through that schooling, the part that is about what you might call pedagogy, what that is about forming character, is kind of tied into that. Why is that? Well, a lot of these are, at least in part, religious colleges, right? Harvard is founded by Puritans. It obviously teaches rhetorics. It teaches the whole gamut of both the sciences and liberal arts as they have, as they were available in the 17th and 18th century. People don't just go there to become clerics, preachers, they go there to become lawyers, they go there to become engineers as soon as that becomes sort of like a thing. So what you do there is you teach knowledge. You obviously don't necessarily focus too heavily on training skills, but you teach knowledge. And because that knowledge is tied to, say, religion, philosophy, all of these kind of things, the assumption is that by going through that education of, say, what we nowadays might call the humanities, especially the theology and philosophy part of it, and obviously law, you may also acquire certain understandings of how to behave and so forth, and what is right and what is wrong, which is, closer to what you might call the pedagogy part. That is where we start out at that time, and that is very close to the European model in that regard, right? You go to a university in Europe, continental Europe, at the same time, you also learn a lot of these overlapping fields. You study a lot of, philosophy, theology, as far as they are already sort of slowly separating. You study law, you study rhetorics, the whole thing. And the assumption is that this will also sort of build your character. Now, obviously, students being students, there's always, the question of what people are doing, that you don't get... The process is not perfect, is what I'm saying. On the other hand, you could argue that being a student, going through all of that work in, say, the system of higher education, does, of course, build character. You will learn certain elements of, say, discipline, of how to actually learn how to study, which is harder than you might think. You get all of that sort of through that, even though you might be drinking and annoying the town guards and all of that stuff that students have been doing ever since we re-established universities, and probably before then. So that is where we start. Now we kind of follow my argument line of before and go to sort of the West, because we, as we have seen, moving further west through the process of colonizing the United States leads to certain changes in the expectations and requirements for an education system are very different if you are somewhere on the Ohio or somewhere else like that. There are obviously certain skills that you still need, and certain basic forms of knowledge that you will still need, because this is the 18th century and becomes the 19th century, and you may be surprised, but yes, literacy is one of those skills where people may not be, reading their Thomas Aquinas in Latin or whatever, but being able to do basic mathematics like counting, adding up, subtracting, that kind of basic mathematical skills and basic reading and writing is something that is spread much further than you might think when you look at, say, historical novels and shit like that. So some form of training is required, but most of the things that you need to survive and thrive on the frontier are, of course, training skills, right? You need to know how to do some basic forms of agriculture, hunting, murdering natives, that kind of stuff. And that's skills that you acquire through training and not through teaching. This is, as I already mentioned, sort of like the point where we slowly reach towards the idea of a social capital becoming more prevalent than cultural capital, and knowledge and intellectualism being less important. But as I said, there's still a basic level of education that is needed. Yes, character and willpower and so forth may be supposedly more important, but once again, the understanding is that just by living on the frontier and surviving there, you will build a certain form of character that is obviously very manly. It's very much about perseverance and shit like that, right? But it is much more training based and not as much teaching based. Now, why is this important? It means that you need different people to do the educating, right? Training and passing along skills can be done by anyone who is skilled in that specific field. When it comes to teaching knowledge in a school setting, something else is required. You need to be an expert up to a point in the field that you are teaching. And you need to have additional skills that make teaching easy, or that allow you to do the teaching stuff. Right? If you become a teacher today, at least in parts of Europe, you study a specific field. In my case, that was mathematics and philosophy, and you additionally take lectures and courses in didactics and stuff like that. Obviously, that's not the case back then, but the understanding is that teaching is knowing the subject you are teaching plus having additional elements that make you a good teacher. Now, in a society that doesn't necessarily need a lot of teaching, but needs a lot of training, and doesn't necessarily value much of that sort of like the aspect of imbuing knowledge versus some basic skills like reading and writing and adding and subtracting a few couple numbers, that expectation shifts, right? Because it sees reading and writing as a skill that can be trained and not necessarily as sort of a skill that is then needed to acquire further knowledge. And that means that you don't necessarily look for specialized qualified teachers. You use someone who has those basic skills and is able to pass those basic skills along, the same way that anyone who's a farmer will teach their children how to do the farming, and anyone who's a hunter will teach them how to do hunting, and then so forth, right? And that leads to a very, very poor and simple form of education. You may have some form of schoolmaster for a specific village, town, whatever, and they are usually people that are incapable of doing other jobs. They often have some form of disability. They have, they are often incapable of, doing their work in a different way. And this is important, they are supported by a specific community who values at least those basic school skills enough to pay them. Very poorly, of course. In fact, what I found really fascinating is that often people were teachers or schoolmasters, as they are called at the time, are often basically sold by or treated like objects, like another commodity. When you have like a ship coming over from Ireland with refugees from Ireland, and it says like the ship from Ireland has beef, pork, and schoolmasters for sale, and I'm like, okay, that's an interesting way of looking at teaching, but it shows you that the idea of a teacher, of the more formal teaching in the schooling sense, is not exactly valued there. And there, as I said, there are external historical reasons of why that is the case. And starting, I don't know, Oxford 2 in, say, Kirtland, Ohio in 1820 is probably not going to work out, because you need all these other, aspects of a society for this to be workable. So that is what we see in the West in the 20s and 30s and so forth. The next part is, of course, once we move over to, once again, the East Coast during the age of industrialization. Once again, there are several things happening there. We already talked about machine politics. We talked about how those organizations that we now call political machines in a lot of ways do a lot of like social work when it comes to integrating immigrants into American society, and also, getting those people to do specific skills, getting them integrated, getting them jobs, all of that kind of stuff. Now, what is important to understand is that with industrialization, what you have there is partly tied to automation. It's also partly specialization. That's how capitalism works, right? You take a skilled craftsman, you take their job, and you split it up into very simple things that need minimal training, because then you can pay those people much less, because all they have to do is, get their fingers crushed in a massive loom or something, instead of like becoming a skilled craftsman. But there's still some minimal training needed. And what is interesting and important here is that both things are training based. Now, if we go back to that split between pedagogy and schooling, right? What we need in that area is, on the one hand, we need to train people to do the skills of, say, working in a fabrics production somewhere at a loom or whatever. Those are basic skills. On the other hand, what you also need is, of course, understanding basically how America works at the time, who to go to when you do need something, who to vote for, which is, obviously what the machine is for, but all these things, especially when you go later into like the late 19th century, when it comes to cities like New York, how to deal with the beginning system of the state, all of these things need training. So both the part of like that we might call pedagogy, how to be a human in the US society, is more or less done through training at the time, just by getting told how to do it, and that's that. Or by maybe just imitation of what you see others do, and those basic skills that you need to have some kind of job in some kind of factory or whatever, also done through training. So even though it does focus both on building character and imbuing skills, both of those are done by training, which further moves and removes what you might call a teaching and imbuing knowledge. It moves that further to the back because it's not needed, or there's just not enough like space, time, and resources to actually provide that to people at the time. Obviously, at the same time, the higher education is still going in East Coast places, but we have once again in that area and at that point of time we have very little space and support for what you might call classical education, higher education, and so forth, because for historical reasons, that's just not what America needs at that specific point in time. Now, this is one important part. Now we got to move to the next important area, and that is, of course, the Gilded Age and what comes after that. And this covers most of the place. We are getting slowly to the end of the 19th century. We have our robber barons. We have more and more areas of industrialization that do, in fact, actually need higher levels of skills, right? Yes, you don't need a lot of skills to hammer in like the rails for the railroad, but you do, of course, need some skilled operators to run that thing. You need certain amounts of engineers. Once you run big businesses, you also need administrators, you need clerks, that kind of stuff. They need to read and write, but they also need to know a bit more about, figures and creative bookkeeping to do all of that, stealing that you kind of need to do if you want to become a robber baron and billionaire. So there are certainly higher requirements for education, but once again they are very much in the skill and training area. So while we kind of focus more on education, on teaching and so forth, it is still mostly training based and not exactly teaching based, right? Like we still impart that and not necessarily knowledge. What happens at the same time, and I think this is a really important and interesting part, is that as one of the first sort of like jobs during the mid of the 19th century, when women's suffrage and women's rights are slowly becoming more important, teaching is one of the first jobs that is opened up to women, and you have a lot of women starting to be, school teachers. Obviously, everything gets really good after that because, patriarchy is obviously immediately removed, and we appreciate women as teachers, we respect them fully as humans, and so forth. Of course, that's not what happens. What happens is, of course, that both the job of teaching is further seen as, women's work, and as we already talked about, higher education has often been seen as sort of effeminate already, so having women teach, it does not necessarily help when it comes to education in a highly, in a gender binary of how we value it. Also, women can be paid less. So once again, we don't necessarily pay teachers at the time a lot of money, or the Americans. And this is an important element to understand how we see education and how we see, not necessarily intellectual labor, but how we see presenting and teaching the ability to do intellectual labor, how we see that, and we don't necessarily value it because it, of society being really fucking sexist at the time. So that's something we see. On the other hand, we still don't necessarily have a point where higher education, classical education, the stuff that we might call, see as tied in with intellectualism, be really appreciated. Our, we already talked about it, the robber barons, the Vanderbilts and so forth. They are not necessarily known for being incredibly well educated. A lot of them are not, and while they do have a little respect for it, sometimes they don't necessarily think that it does actually help you become a robber baron. It may, give you qualms, because remember, that form of education is supposed to also make you a moral character in a lot of ways, and turns out being a capitalist is not necessarily the most moral thing you can do. This is one sort of where we are at that point. There's like two more sort of regional things that I want to look at before we can slowly end this. One of them is California, and in particular Stanford. If you have not read Malcolm Harris's Palo Alto, I highly recommend it, because what we see with one of those robber barons, that is Leland Stanford, founding Stanford University, it is very deliberately a training facility to create an elite, to create human resources that can be exploited massively. He compares it with his stud farm, where he literally breeds faster racehorses and does all of that with scientific methods, but the goal is to create people, to create students that are smarter than everyone else and are better at inventing stuff and better at doing tech jobs. It's not made to, create an intellectual elite. It's made to create experts that can then be used by those corporations, because this is slowly where we see humans, not necessarily as humans that do labor, but we see them as human capital, as human resources, and that is not necessarily helping with the whole education thing, is it? So that's one small example that I think is important to see. And then there is, of course, another one, and that is the South. See, one important other aspect of education is, of course, the education system is, of course, that it can be used to keep the status quo alive, to defend and re-entrench and perpetuate hierarchies. That's just like how this stuff works, right? You go to school, your teachers tell you how the world works, you keep that, unless your teachers also teach you how to question why the world works this way. And what we see after the Civil War is, of course, that the elites in the South, your former slave owners, your plantation owners, and so forth, who have always had a tie, certain ties to Europe and have had like that old school European education in a lot of ways, very clearly being interested in keeping their, positions as leaders as the elites. And how do you do that? Well, you do that by preventing anyone else from having enough education to do anything but menial labor for which you are not supposed to pay them. But we all know how that went after sort of like Restoration, which failed really quickly and so forth, right? You keep both white and freed slaves, black people poor by keeping them uneducated. That's a deliberate choice when it comes to schooling in the South at that specific point. I just wanted to talk about those geographically specific locations during the latter half of the 19th century. Now, what we also need to look at is, of course, the religious part. We spoke about that in part of Strand 1 and slightly in Strand 2. Because our evangelical strand is following through these sort of like changes in how education is seen and valued throughout American history. We start with our Puritans, which are clearly doing a lot of like teaching knowledge and so forth. Once the focus of evangelical religion shifts to more personal connections, to a more experience-based form of religion, that form of training is seen as a hindrance, right? It may lead you to question stuff. It may lead you to a more cerebral approach to religion, which does take away from your Methodist, your Baptist, and other revivalist sort of like approaches to church. Now, after a while, these groups, one after the other, do, however, see the need to at least provide certain forms of basic training to their individual preachers, right? So you start to see people, each congregation sort of founding their own sort of like Bible colleges, training schools, and while those at the beginning provide what you might call training skills, right? You get taught how to do preaching, and preaching is a skill that you can, practice and so forth. That's part of it. You don't necessarily get like deep training and deep teaching in theology. You don't go and read fucking Aquinas and St. Augustine and Origenes and all of these people. No, you learn how to build rhetorics and how to frighten the living daylights out of poor farmers and genociders who are sitting out there in the freezing field in winter and really need their souls saved. But the thing with these kind of like colleges is, of course, that people who teach these things become more and more educated. You slowly build up an educated class, and the problem with education is, of course, that it's a habit, and people start reading, and you build an establishment that slowly moves beyond that, and that is how a lot of these groups, while deliberately starting out as training and training basic skills of preaching and maybe doing some basic training when it comes to character, they slowly shift over to what we might call the teaching model when it comes to general knowledge and general understanding, shifting towards an appreciation, at least, of cultural capital as a key sort of way of, reaching not necessarily dominance, but reaching higher positions in those specific societies. So we see how, at least in that area, around training in the evangelical area, cultural and social capital are slowly sort of balancing out in a way that they were not at the beginning of each of these movements. This is, of course, an important aspect, because what happens at that point is that there is a split. As always, there is. Once you have enough pressure, you have a split. Interestingly, when we go back to Dwight L. Moody, who we talked about very early on, that guy has like 2 colleges. He founded 2 different Bible colleges in his name. One of them is, of course, Moody Bible College in Chicago, and the other one I have currently forgotten. And one of them turned incredibly fundamentalist and radical. The other one is a very progressive form of where you do more like higher criticism and theology in the way that you may recognize if you study theology at a university, say, in Europe these days. So we see that split literally happening with each of these denominations. And what we obviously see is that the fundamentalist approach stays at the training level. It's training people to both have a very specific form of character by just like hammering in specific patterns of behavior, often quite literally beating it into people, and training them to have the skills that are appreciated without giving any further context, and possibly also training them to become spreaders of the faith. Now that is the evangelical area that I also wanted to talk about. So, 2 or 3 final things that we need to look at before we're done here. How is all of that possible? Well, the basic thing is that we have that huge difference between different places and different times in US education, and that's because of how to finance the thing. See, there is one way of doing that, and that is financing the entire education system through taxes. So everyone in the entire place, the entire United States, has the same form of education paid out of the same pot. That is, of course, not what happens. And there's powerful interests and reasons why that is. On the one hand, it's the historical one that, yes, paying for fucking Harvard College is a very different thing than paying for one schoolmaster out there in fucking Illinois in 1835, right? That's a huge difference. So the requirements are so different for historical reasons at the time that having the same sort of like system for everyone does not work. And then there's, of course, powerful interests of keeping it that way, right? Once we have that situation with, on the one hand, even religious Bible colleges, and on the other hand, say in the South, the racist elites wanting stuff to stay that way. They are very clearly staying on that states' rights thing and on the local community way of running things, because that allows them to control the education system to keep the status quo alive in the way they want and not have anyone any outside influences on that. And you do that through financing, which is like every community pays for their own school. You do that through property taxes nowadays, I think, in a lot of ways, but yeah. And what we see through that is, of course, that for all time in the US, in a lot of ways, teaching has been seen as another sort of commodity interaction, as a trade, right? You have a school and you have customers of the school, and those customers are fundamentally not the students, but the parents of the students or the community that pays that specific school teacher. And that means they get the right to decide what to do. So even from for historical reasons and for, ideological reasons already at the time, the education system is very difficult to standardize in that regard, at least, or to control from a federal level. And that is something that will obviously become a problem later on. Now that we've spoken about all of that, we need to talk about one final thing, and that is, of course, the brief spring of the progressive era. See, the 20th century kind of starts with a slow move towards some progress, right? Science becomes more of a thing. We have the 19th century where, Darwin shows up, all kinds of other aspects. Liebig shows up, does like a lot of agricultural stuff, and it takes forever for all of these things to be accepted. Some of them still aren't accepted, but more people realize that this is probably a good thing to have more education. Jobs become more complex, society becomes more complex. The more complex a society becomes, the more education you kind of need to navigate it. Jobs become more complex. The more complex a job becomes, the more training you need, the more education you need to do that, and people realize that. And at least in some areas, that means that the education system, the university, high school, and so forth system is boosted. It's more, it's professionalized. People start actually thinking about how to teach and not just what to teach. These things happen at the end of the 19th century and move into the 20th century. States, cities, and so forth are willing to pay more for a proper education system. This is something we see in, say, New York City slowly with, once again, the Democrat Party under L. Smith, which is still Tammany Hall, but certainly Tammany Hall on its way to becoming basically the force that drives FDR to do FDR things later on, right? We see that happening at the time. We also see, science becoming something that is taught in schools. Evolution showing up in school books. All of these things happen during the time. Universities become more open. Even, say, Brigham Young University does, in fact, start to teach comparative religion and things like that. There is a sort of like flowering of or reconnecting with a more European form of education in a lot of ways. Communication between America and Europe becomes more open when it comes to respecting certain forms of education, because America, after World War I in a ways, but also before that, during the Spanish War, American-Spanish War, US-Spanish War, and all of those places, has sort of asserted its own place and identity that those levels of insecurity that we've seen in the last trend when it comes to establishing American identity are less important. Like, you don't need to hate European education that much anymore to establish your Americanness. You can kind of slowly understand that maybe some of these things are good. This is happening in the 1920s already. And there's fightbacks. We already spoke about the Scopes trial, where people try to push back against teaching of certain things. And we see more of that during, say, FDR's time, when, once again, experts are valued in forming policies and so forth, and education is financed more because, one of the results of the Depression, of the Dust Bowl and so forth, is understanding that maybe certain forms of how we've done things are no longer viable, and allowing people to learn more, to study more, are, of course, maybe a good and helpful thing. One final aspect of that is, of course, the GI Bill that allows a lot of veterans of World War II, at least, to then go and, learn shit at universities and all that. This is, of course, happening. And while our forces like, the billionaires, the financial elites that really just want people trained to do their jobs for as little money as possible and not have like additional skills that they might also have to pay for, or maybe even have like the ability to question why they are in a system that is kind of happening right now. They're not exactly fans of that. They want to have control over how to do education. One of those examples we've already seen is, say, Stanford University. And we have religious schools and the religious fundamentalists who also want to, train people into their specific form of a parallel worldview and parallel universe almost. One final point here is, of course, that a lot of the education, the broader education, what we might call teaching of knowledge and understanding that goes beyond just training of skills, is in fact handled by labor unions, for example, and other movements that are broadly seen as, maybe not socialist, definitely not communist, but certainly further on the left, political left spectrum. It's very much connected to the labor movement, where educating laborers and workers is seen as one way of, allowing them to question and better their situation and change the world. This will become important later. So, like with our previous two strands, what we see is that there is a point of crisis in the 1920s and 1930s where it seems that progressive forces are slowly gaining the upper hand, and both the financial economic elite class, the billionaire class, so to speak, and the religious fundamentalist groups have had major losses, major struggles when it comes to domineering U.S. politics, U.S. society, and U.S. Thought and identity. The question is, of course, what happens during that time, and how are they going to strike back? And that will be the final part of this long video. I know, after 70 minutes of this, you're as eager as I am to finally go and bash some billionaires and Christian fascists. But first, we gotta do some more heavy lifting. Sorry, that's the price for this being not an intellectual video. Cheers. Alright, we are sort of on the last leg of this long journey. And before we move further on, I want to recapitulate what I have been trying for the last part of this video. See, I tried to look at three specific aspects of U.S. history, that being, well, the the religious history, the history of anti-elitist sentiments in the more political and economic sense, and the history of education in the United States throughout the 18th and 19th century, to explain how certain historical processes and things that were specific to, well, the United States history led to a certain political and societal structure at the end of the 19th century, where we have fairly clear hierarchies in both religion and economics and politics. My point here is that while every country is and has, elements of anti-intellectualism in all kinds of ways, there are specific aspects to American history that led to that specific outcome. We've seen how there was a shift from cultural capital towards economic capital through social capital, that led to a certain marginalization of the intellectual and educational elites of the East Coast, at least when it comes to their access to political power. Obviously, people were still part of the sort of like the lower levels of the financial elites, because it still costs a shitload of money to actually, go to Harvard or anything of the sorts, or go to Europe and have a classical education in one of the top universities in Europe. But their access to the actual political power, that lessened over time from the beginning of the 19th century all the way to the end of the 19th century, with obviously some exceptions like Theodor Roosevelt and in the beginning of the 20th century. We'll get there in a second. So that was one strain. That was partly because of, the requirements for a large expansion to the West and colonizing efforts and so forth, which are very, very different from, the kind of structure that you have in Europe. It led to the definition or sort of creation and construction of an American identity that in part was distancing itself from higher education and so forth as an ideal. That was one part of it. Also tied to the requirements of, providing spiritual care to a very poorly educated, thin-spread group of humans, led to, the dominance of certain forms of evangelical Christianity that led to certain, that we already talked about, that are, fundamentalist or tend to become fundamentalist. All of that also, once we have to deal with the arrival of large numbers of immigrants, leads to, other requirements for the education system and all of that. My point is, at the end of the 19th century, the 19th century does go on beyond, say, the year 1900. We can probably talk about it slowly ending around World War I in a lot of ways in this regard. We have a fairly clear hierarchy in the United States. We have our robber barons, captains of industry, whatever you want to call them, very, very rich individuals, your Vanderbilts, your Leland Stanfords, those kind of people, your Rockefellers coming up, those kind of people, Carnegies, and so forth. We have these kind of people that have an oversized influence on politics, business, and a lot of other things that are actively seen as the elite of the country and as, fulfilling roles that everyone aspires to. They personify the American dream or the perfect American. They are men of action, men of commercial success, and that is what people aspire to. So we have a hierarchy in that regard. We have a hierarchy in the American South that has been re-established after Restoration kind of failed or was very clearly subverted by such captains of industry and so forth, that kept the hierarchy of rich white landowners, keeping both freed slaves, free blacks, and free white people, poor white people, in a state of very much almost bondage through sharecropping and all sorts of things, by keeping them away from forms of higher education, which would allow them to, get better qualified jobs and so forth. Education in this regard becomes a tool to re-establish or at least keep a hierarchy going. We have seen all of these elements. Now, at the end of the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, what we see, and this is the part that I want to talk about here first before we talk about where stuff gets really bad, we see all of these truths, not truths, but these certainties and these hierarchies come under more and more pressure. Partly that is the result of rapid industrialization and, the rise of industrial capitalism in the United States and other parts of the world. Because it turns out at some point, while you need basic education and skill training to do a lot of simpler parts of industrialized capitalism, at some point you need more education, and science has moved on throughout the 19th century in physics, in chemistry, biology, in a lot of parts, and that means you need certain levels of higher education, which is where we see high schools becoming more of a thing, because you need these larger levels of skill training that do often come with, access to at least some abilities to perform what I call intellectual labor. And that is one part that is happening. At the same time, we have, through immigration and the rise of industrial capitalism, we also have a sort of rise of the labor movement, whether it is full-on socialist ideas or more other forms of, organized labor work and so forth. What we see is these groups gaining more and more power, and that is something that starts heavily in the early parts of the 20th century. It gets a bit of a setback during World War I, but stuff like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which leads to some improvements when it comes to security, and afterwards. You should look this up. It's a really, really important historical event. Or the several battles around labor, about unionizing in West Virginia's coal fields, really reaching their top at the Battle of Blair Mountain, which once again you should look up, because you'll learn something about American history that maybe you didn't know. Show that the rise of labor, while being fiercely combated by the capitalist class, is bringing in certain elements of emancipation to groups that up to that point did not necessarily have a lot of access to education. A lot of labor work, union work, does consist in, educating union members in their rights and other aspects like that. So we see how the rise of capitalism kind of brings these elements with it. It brings with it a demand of more education, more modern scientific education, and it brings with it the rise of labor that spreads, and labor movement that spread those that education to people that had previously lacked access to stuff beyond a very specific skill training, into other aspects that, once again, give access to the ability and skills needed to perform intellectual labor. So we have that aspect. At the same time, with the rise of science that actually works, natural sciences, biology, chemistry, physics, that kind of stuff that actually works, that becomes obviously a threat in, the general form of modernity. That becomes a threat to certain parts of, especially evangelical, fundamentalist Christianity that relies on the Bible as the direct communication of, God to Christians. Obviously, with the rise of stuff like higher criticism in coming from continental Europe, theology also deals with this, but in general, people start looking at biology as an actual science that works, and that means stuff like evolution and theory of evolution, Darwin's theory of evolution and stuff like that kind of seep into our education systems, which once again need to be more scientific to provide the labor that the capitalists need at that point. So that brings that crisis of evangelical Christianity that leads to some people becoming more progressive and other groups becoming more fundamentalist. That all kind of coming to a head during the Scopes trial that we already kind of mentioned. And this is kind of the point that I wanted to make. We have all of these certainties that came out of the long 19th century of American history, and they are all put under stress. We see the rise of what you might call progressive politics. A lot of times they start in large cities, particularly in New York with Governor Al Smith and reactions to stuff like the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. We see how certain labor safety rules are put into place. Education is slowly boosted. We have the beginnings of what you might call a social security, or the state actually starting to become somewhat more concerned with the welfare of its people and not just with facilitating the maximum gain for the owners of capital. That is something that slowly happens. And we see capital fighting back, we see fundamentalist religion fighting back at the time. But they're fighting back in a very, very brutal way, right? The Scopes trial is one way of doing that, using the law to silence education. And at that time it fails. It leads to fundamentalist Christians being ridiculed by large parts of at least the North and the East Coast, and probably the West Coast as well. The South obviously sees things slightly different, but we see a lot of these conflicts being fought out in a very direct, blunt, and violent way. The KKK in its second edition is part of that. In fact, it's very much supportive of the Scopes trial in a lot of ways. We have that. We have at the same time Governor Al Smith's attempt of becoming president of the United States fail in a last sort of rearing up of the old forces of capital, voting in one Herbert Hoover. Once again, I've said this before, never trust a man named Hoover. They suck. That's kind of the point. Hoover does, of course, raise tariffs. Yeah, keep that in mind. Which leads to the whole crash of 1929. There are obviously elements, around the gold standard and other things tied to that, which leads to the beginning of the Great Depression. We have the Dust Bowl. We can't go into that today, but it's kind of linked to some aspects of American approach to doing stuff that is really bad. If you want to learn more about that, I highly recommend you read Cadillac Desert by Mark Reisner. It's worth your time. We have all of that leading to, sort of social upheaval, which leads to the bonus army, which are obviously the veterans of World War I that want to have their guaranteed bonus payments paid somewhat earlier, because right now they're poor as fuck, because it's the Great Depression. They all march into Washington, D.C. in 1932 under still the Hoover administration, and Hoover decides to call in the army under everyone's favorite nuke fetishist Douglas MacArthur to violently clear out of these veterans. That's not a good look in a lot of ways, right? It's one of the last acts of the Hoover administration, and people like Smedley Butler, who supported as one of America's most famous generals and soldiers at the time, who supported the bonus army in that regard, and was, or claimed to be, a Republican, actually, through those actions, supported President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to become the new president, which leads us to the New Deal and all of these things. We need to look at one more point here before we can move into what this last part of my long exploration of anti-intellectualism in America is going to be, and that is the business plot. Now, you should look this up if you want to learn more about it. Behind the Bats have made a really good podcast episode about it. There's other books about it. It's an interesting thing. So FDR becomes president. FDR starts an administration that pulls in a lot of experts, a lot of academics and a lot of people from New York that were part of Al Smith's administration in New York and have experience when it comes to labor rights, when it comes to a lot of these elements that were already tested on, in New York, for example. And because this is the 1920s and 1930s, people are immediately scared that this is clearly communism, if not something worse, and communism being obviously atheism and so forth. just to be clear, this is not communism. It's not even socialism. It's maybe some elements of what you might call market socialism in some regards. But the, old capitalist elite, the billionaire class, so to speak, right? These people feel that they are losing their almost exclusive access to power through these slow reforms that FDR is putting into place, and they label it socialism. And socialism clearly is something that was discussed at the time. Labor movements are still fairly strong and getting at least some protections that they were fighting for in the 20s with, against the state. They are getting these. And the business class is scared. And so they decide to actually plan a putsch, a coup. They try to recruit Smedley Butler, once again, who then testifies at a congressional committee and talks about all of this. They try to build up a proto-fascist or fascist veterans organization to push FDR either out of office completely or turn him into a figurehead, with Smedley Butler as the actual person behind it, trying to maybe move slowly closer to fascist Germany, and of course, revoke any labor protections or anything of the sorts, and re-establish the rule of the untrammeled forces of capital. Luckily, this fails. And I'm bringing this up not only because I think more people need to know about it, but I'm bringing this up because this is the last sort of effort of these old forces to use violence and use very blunt, brutal methods to regain their power. They failed. The evangelical part failed during the Scopes trial. They failed up to a point during the destruction of the bonus army. At least popularly, it definitely lost Hoover the vote even more, the presidency even more than. Obviously, it was already difficult before with the Great Depression, but it certainly did not help. And they failed with this final aspect of using actual force to overthrow the government. It fails. And this leads to a couple of years, all the way into World War II, of mild reforms, of social reforms and so forth. And it leads to a point where these old hierarchies of the 19th century, the evangelical Christians, the white supremacists of the, mostly far south, and the top-tier sort of elite of capital-owning classes, the billionaire class, so to speak, right? Those people need to sit back and rethink approaches to regaining power that they have clearly lost throughout, the first half of the 20th century, partly because of, historical events somewhat outside of their own sort of control, those being, World War I and World War II, and the collapse of the global economy from around 1929. Yes, having tariffs and so forth that Hoover did not help. It actually made things worse, but it's not just Herbert Hoover that created the crisis of 1929. Let's be clear. There's more stuff happening here. So we have this sort of loss of control of the old hierarchies, and them trying to re-establish control will be the narrative of the rest of this video. But first we need to look at what happens around World War II, because that's another important historical element that is obviously outside of purely US control, but that does absolutely change the face of US society in some major ways. One of them is, of course, that during World War II, women are entering the workforce because everyone else is over here dying on the beaches of Normandy or dying in the jungles of the Pacific. That every white man, black men were still mostly excluded from, military service, or at least combat service, because this is still a very racist country that we're talking about. So we have slowly women moving out of taking over roles that were exclusive to men during the 1920s and 30s when it comes to factory jobs and all of that kind of stuff. There are really good books and so forth if you want to learn about the kind of jobs that women did in the 1930s and 40s and how some of them worked on the Manhattan Project, for example, and stuff like that. But what this means is, once you have these kind of large-scale societal shifts, it's very difficult to undo them. And that leads, after World War II, that leads, of course, to slowly at least, the burgeoning of what you might call the second wave feminist movement, with books like The Feminine Mystique being published in, I think, 1963, which look at how housewives are very dissatisfied with their job, once again only being at home and not having the ability to work in jobs that also fulfill them. It's slow beginning. It's also still very racialized, especially towards, obviously for white women and so forth. There's probably like second wave feminism that we don't have the time to go into today, and I'm not the expert on it anyway, but we see the feminist movement gathering energy. We also see the civil rights movement gain force after World War II, because once again, World War II did certainly break down some of these barriers, some of these racist barriers, at least in some regards. And at some point, yes, the military does in fact get desegregated. And you can see from that slowly these events that once again are very historically necessary at that specific point, or can be justified as historically necessary. We see large-scale societal shifts and changes to the better, let's be clear, that are hard to undo afterwards, and that certainly further threaten or weaken the positions of power and hierarchy that the white supremacists in the American South, the US South, and the big capitalists, in some part industrial capitalists in some areas, and of course evangelical Christians hold during that time. They are slowly losing more ground, but they are also slowly adapting to find new ways of getting their stuff together. And the first big part is, of course, anti-communism. See, after World War II, it doesn't take long for the Cold War to really start up in earnest, and the very slow changes of what you might call market socialism under FDR still need to distance the US from the Soviet Union in a lot of ways, which brings us to obviously it already starts under Harry Truman, but it certainly moves much further under President Eisenhower. We see the hunt for supposed communists, supposed fellow travelers who are at least sympathetic to the Soviet Union in some regard, maybe had some socialist ideas, and possibly might be spies. That's the era that you often call McCarthyism, but you probably better call it the Red Scare, because it starts before McCarthy really gets into his power, and it kind of goes on after McCarthy is over and dead. But it starts there. We start slow purging of these social services that were established under FDR, and a lot of people working in these organizations are slowly pushed out. We see teachers getting threatened, possibly. And what we see here already is a first step that will become much more problematic later, is an alliance between Christianity and anti-communism. Obviously, communists, at least the Soviet variety, is very much not exactly fans of organized religion, to put it mildly. And I'm putting it very mildly here. Yes, the Soviet Union, especially under Stalin, was bad in that regard. Don't get me wrong. But what we see is, as I said, first elements there, because some of the things when accusations of communist sympathies don't necessarily stick. What we see is accusations of atheism, which then obviously are a sign of communism, right? And so we see how the very clearly anti-communist organized aspect of, say, the capitalist elites are starting to understand that they can use Christianity as a tool in their toolkit to attack, to regain power. And it's still very slow here, right? And that's important to understand. And once we have desegregation begin with the civil rights movement, what we also have is, of course, a further attack on on white supremacy in especially the southern states, but generally, it's not just limited to there, but we see that happening. And this is where the next sort of element starts happening, and that is, of course, we already seen sort of like a retreat after the Scopes trial into religious schools. A lot of these religious schools are, Also, in the South, we talked about that. That's one way of keeping a specific racial hierarchy going, by controlling education in a lot of ways. But now, with civil rights becoming a big deal, especially after the assassination of Kennedy, and once all of that stuff is put into legislation, schools are getting desegregated, or at least some of them are, which is an attack on that religious control and that white supremacist control in especially the South, which leads to another alliance between, Christian fascists, not to put too bit of a point on it, like the Christian right, the fundamentalist evangelicals on the one hand, and white supremacists allying in that regard, or closer, allying closer than they did before. So it's only a matter of time before all these three groups, white supremacists, Christian fascists, and of course capitalist elites, will all make common cause and try to regain power. That is the rest of this story. But before we can move there, we need to do a bit more theory. Alright, it's time to talk about neoliberalism for a second. Now, I'm recommending you read A Brief History of Neoliberalism by David Harvey, and possibly Globalists by Quinn Slobodian, for two narratives about the history of neoliberalism. I think both of them are worth reading. They do contradict some, but they also overlap in a lot of ways, and I think that's more important here. If you feel like you want to read a lot more detail, then I also recommend reading Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation, which looks at the decisions around a free market, or what is called a free market, that led to the collapse of the gold standard, the collapse of the economy in 1929, and the rise of fascism. It's a really good book. It's a bit more dense in its economic history. Why am I saying this? Because what I need to talk about now is kind of tied to those three authors in a lot of ways. See, when we talk about markets, we mean, of course, a system that allows to trade one thing for another. That's basically a market. And ever since people started misunderstanding Adam Smith, they think that a market has to be completely divorced from rules. Markets have to run completely on their own, and that's when they work the best. We'll talk about why I don't say free market here for a moment, in a moment. My point is that what happens after the collapse of 1929 with the rise of the New Deal and post-war Europe, in a lot of ways, what we see is the opposite. What we see is, in fact, having markets embedded in society. That's what you might call market socialism, or whatever else you want to call these approaches that making markets serve society by making sure that capital doesn't accumulate too much in too few hands, with making sure that laborers are having some form of power, bargaining power, collective bargaining power through unions, all of these kind of things. That is what you might call embedding a market in society. That's in fact the term that Karl Polanyi uses, and I think it's important to understand that. Now, the goal is, of course, of capitalist elites is, of course, to disembed the market. And this is kind of where we see Slobodian and David Harvey disagree. I think both are correct. They're just focusing on different aspects. So David Harvey claims that the goal of neoliberalism, which we will talk about in more detail in a second, is to disembed markets once again and keep them as far away from democratic control as possible. That's disembedding. Quinn Slobodian calls it encasing the market against democratic control. And that's just, I guess, how you want to read these different reforms, whether they are just taking away democratic control or whether they are also making sure that there is no further democratic control through, say, trade agreements that are legally binding but outside of the control of the different, the governments and the people of the states that have made those trade agreements, because, once they're agreed on, they're legally binding and thus follow law and no longer politics in a lot of ways. So that's something that will happen in a bit. But before we can go further into that specific aspect of neoliberalism, we need to actually define what neoliberalism is. And here I'm going to go with David Harvey for a moment. David Harvey says that neoliberalism as an ideology which uses neoclassical economics from the 19th century and some forms of classical liberalism is, started by people like Ulrich von Mises and Friedrich von Hayek and other people in the Mont Pelerin Society and others around that. It ends up with, people like Milton Friedman and the Chicago Boys. But basically, it is an ideology that believes that markets, once again, are working the best and when they are outside of any further control. If they have no controls, then they work the best. And that is the best way of run every aspect of human life and society. That's the important part. In that case, what we need is a state, what neoliberals think states are needed for are to guarantee the stability of a currency, for global exchange, to use violence and force, if need be, to make sure that markets stay out of control and out of democratic control or anything else and can work as rules-free as possible. And thirdly, to create markets in places where there are no markets yet. That means, for example, when it comes to the environment, you can think of emission certificates, that kind of stuff. You can think of, say, healthcare that needs to be turned into a market. You can think of education that needs to be turned into a market. Everything that is not yet a market has to be commodified and turned into a market because that's the most efficient and best way of organizing these aspects of human existence. Now, these three aspects are the basics of neoliberalism, according to David Harvey, and I think he's spot on with that part. What is important to understand, however, is a big aspect of this, the method of doing that, because talking about economics is boring. It's frustrating, it's nuanced and detailed and lots of numbers and stuff, and yeah. Talking politics is also often frustrating, especially when we talk about, legislation and details and so forth. So the big step and trick, basically, it's a bit of a magic trick here, conjuring trick of neoliberalism, is to phrase these conversations not in terms of economics or politics, but to phrase them in words, in moral terms. That's why they talk about a free market, because freedom and liberty and individual freedom, these are things that everyone likes, right? They're good. They have a long history of words being, having lots of positive connotations. So that's what you use to actually enact a very harsh political and economic policy. All right, theory is over. It's time to bring this monstrosity home by naming names and blaming motherfuckers. Cheers. So, it's time to talk about the last, say, 60 or 70 years and where things went horribly wrong. So, we need to look at a couple of different organizations and how they intersect and, take over America in a lot of ways. So, there is a secular one that is, of course, the John Birch Society. Put a pin into that, we'll get back into that later. Then there is, of course, the Christian and Evangelical right. That is, people like the Moral Majority, people like Phyllis Schlafly, people like Jerry Falwell, those kind of people. Those are the more the Christian right in a lot of ways, and then there's of course the far right, your KKKs and different fringe groups that are just like white supremacists and Nazis, and we'll see how those all kind of tie together, and by taking over both the jurisdiction, the legal system, and of course by taking over the education system, lead us to where we are now. Through the methods that we just discovered are key to, neoliberal ideology and praxis in a lot of ways. So, let's start with the John Birch Society. Founded by Robert Welch in the late 1950s, it is a group that is very actively trying to fight the global communist threat, which, to be clear, obviously does sort of, kind of, maybe slightly exist in a lot of ways during the Cold War, in that there are obviously the Soviet Union on the one hand and the United States on the other hand are currently, waging a global war about political systems. So that is not exactly wrong. Where things kind of get problematic is, of course, the paranoia that communists are very much taking over the United States in all kinds of ways and need to be fought tooth and nail. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of through lines from people that joined the John Birch Society that used to be part of certain Nazi Germany sympathizer groups in the 1930s, just to be clear. And there's through lines from the business plot to the John Birch Society. So what the John Birch Society is of course a very secretive organization founded by millionaire businessman Robert Welch and a bunch of other very rich businessmen. Some of them are sort of only affiliated and not full members, but a lot of them are, as I said, rich businessmen. Your Coors brewery owners are very much affiliated with that specific group, and their goal is to fight global communism by becoming a bit of an underground movement, by imitating what they suspect the left is doing. They are building front organizations and keeping their memberships very secretive and all of that in a lot of ways, while also publishing incredibly weird pamphlets about communist threats and veering off into very blunt anti-Semitism very early on. That is something that happens all the time. I guess the most famous book coming out of that whole monstrosity is, of course, the Politician, which is a book in which Robert Welch claims President Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower, is in fact a willing and knowing tool of the global communist threat. You can think about that what you want. It's wrong. It's full-on paranoia and conspiracy thinking, and it's important to see that part of the right being part of, well, the John Birch Society in that regard. They are, what we have seen is sort of like the arm of the very high financial elites and business elites in America, the capitalist elites, the heirs of your robber barons and so forth, that are obviously trying to claw back power, but they are now doing this in a more underground, subversive way than they did before. That is the John Birch Society. It has, from the beginning, connections to different parts of the religious right, or the soon-to-be religious right. A famous writer of the Left Behind series, Chris LaHaye, actually worked for the John Birch Society in the 60s and 70s. So there's that. Later, president, prophet, revelator, and so forth of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Ezra Taft Benson, who also was Secretary of Agriculture for Dwight D. Eisenhower, was also very much connected to the John Birch Society in all kinds of ways, and later on did in fact almost run as running mate with George Wallace, Alabama governor, and he of the famous segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever speech. So there are connections to the religious groups already within the John Birch Society, but mostly they are a business group that are collecting very rich people that are paranoid about the threat of global communism. That is the first group. And they relatively early on develop certain tactics that might seem familiar to you, by which I mean they find people that are part of the John Birch Society, associated with the John Birch Society, and so forth, and those people enter local school boards to then attack teachers and get books that they deem to be part of the communist threat and communist plan and agenda to morally destroy the Christian values of American children, to get those books banned from schools. That's all the way back in the 60s, right? So these strategies are not new. So that is one group. Now let's look at the Christian side of things. What we see here is, of course, that once the different parts of the Civil Rights Act are enacted and schools are desegregated, some of the Christian schools are not necessarily, happy about the whole desegregation thing, because they are very much already white supremacist groups in a lot of ways. The problem is, of course, that that does not necessarily go too well, because there's too much momentum behind the civil rights movement at the time. And when Bob Jones University is getting its tax status revoked for not desegregating, that is very much sort of like the point where the Christian right realizes that it has to somehow shift tone. Yes, the Mormon Church holds out a lot longer, until 1978, when they finally revoked their priesthood ban for black members and temple ban for black members. But during the 70s, the Christian right realizes that it has to shift tone. tone, which is where we have that full-on alliance between these different groups. And finally, also drawing in the Catholics. American Catholics being much more fundamentalist than a lot of European Catholics in a lot of ways. And this is where we finally get our good, well, most terrible hypocrite, Phyllis Schlafly, who is Catholic and is very much defending the idea of a full-on patriarchy and the idea that women are only staying at home, and which is obviously really cool for someone who is very much bringing in the money in this family and working all the time. But her idea, and partly, well, what she manages to do is to ally the Catholic right with the evangelical right, something that never happen before. And she does that by shifting, remember what we said about like going from politics to morals in a lot of ways, by shifting the Christian focus from segregation and desegregation, which is clearly racist, and that's something that people are uncomfortable with at the time, shifting that to abortion rights, which are a much more morally fraught topic in a lot of ways, and that is something that she gets the Christian right, the evangelical right on board with. Catholics have obviously always been against abortions, that's something that has always been around. Evangelicals, not so much. All the way in the 60s, even the Southern Baptist Convention was neutral to almost positive about abortions. That has obviously changed by now, we all know that, and but that's the stroke that we see here by shifting from political topics or things that are seen as political at the time, that is of course segregation and civil rights, by shifting to a much clearer, to a problem that is, or a topic that is much easier to be phrased in mere moral terms and not in political terms. The Christian right unites around this specific element. This group, and this includes, as I said, Phyllis Schlafly and her movement, it includes the moral majority, something that Jerry Falwell and other evangelical preachers found. And finally, it also involves the Mormon Church once Phyllis Schlafly manages to rope in the Women's Relief Society, which is sort of like the women's organization part of the LDS during the 1970s. This is a very strong alliance whose first goal is to make sure that the Equal Rights Amendment does not get passed, and they managed to actually do that. In particular, Utah, which was almost, was certain to pass it once Phyllis Schlafly does get the Women's Relief Society on board, which is its whole own topic, does actually not pass or reject the Equal Rights Amendment. Other states go back on their already, support of the Equal Rights Amendment, and that's one first sort of big step where this backlash becomes successful. So that is where we see the Christian right. What about the white supremacists and the Nazis? Now, here's where stuff is a bit slower. See, throughout this time, the civil rights movement is very popular, very strong in a lot of ways. Yes, it has backlash. Of course, there's racism. Don't get me wrong. It's not a big problem. But the more overt attempts at curbing civil rights protests, at curbing the civil rights movement, at halting, keeping the United States an even more racist country than it is at the time, those being the presidential campaigns of Barry Goldwater and then George Wallace in 1964 and 1968. Campaigns that are very clearly running on racism and on white supremacy, while trying to frame this also in individual liberties and stuff like that. Those campaigns fail. And that shows, I think, that white supremacy is, at least in the 60s, not something that has an electoral majority. So these groups are, at least for the time being, somewhat pushed to the side. And the campaign that we see is, of course, take over, as I said, the legal system, take over the education system, and that's maybe reintroduce forms of, structural racism through the back door. So, how are we going to do that? Well, as I said, on the one hand, develop legal theories that kind of go down that road. We all know about, inner urban crime and all of these ways that things are framed to, blame people of color as criminals and so forth, and the long march of, getting conservative judges back into different courts to finally revoke the Roe v. Wade abortion rights and so forth, where we use that moral framing to get these people on courts that then can also, repeal all kinds of other important cases and so forth to roll back the country in all kinds of other ways is one strategy there. That's not the one that I need to focus on too much right now. I think that has been documented by a lot of people, and we all know that. What we need to focus on is the attack on education, because we're still talking about anti-intellectualism here, right? So, remember what I said about neoliberalism being about creating markets where there are no markets and commodifying things that have not been commodified before? Well, education is one of these goods that is getting commodified. And there's a number of ways of going there. On the one hand, you have the purely, moral, political argument or neoliberal argument of, well, it's better if we actually do that because that will lead to a better education system, because clearly having a free market or an uncontrolled, disembedded market is the best way of doing that. But there are other ways of getting there. And that's kind of what I want to focus on here for the time being. All right, so what we need to talk about is what kind of education. Obviously, we already talked about the American education system being something of a, well, weird place or weird thing throughout, its sort of colonial and so forth, expansionist history in a lot of ways. One important thing that we see is state control, or at least federal control over education through the GI Bill, through all of these kind of things, pushing a specific pushing education on a broader level. That is something that we see as a result of, well, first the New Deal, and then of course the Great Society, which is Lyndon Johnson's approach to pushing these things, and in between, the GI Bill, as I said, World War II. Those are the results that lead to broader education. However, what we also have to take into account is once again that Cold War thing, right? See, you may have heard about the Sputnik shock, right? Despite no one really thinking about it, after the Manhattan Project and the US developing nuclear weapons first, the next big sort of like win on a global scale is, of course, the Soviet Union putting up the first satellite ever, that being Sputnik. And that kind of shocked the US in a lot of ways, leading to the big questions like, why didn't we do that? Which means, well, clearly we don't have enough experts and so forth, so we need to work on higher education, and we need to produce scientists who can get shit up into space. This works really well. Obviously, we see what President JFK did back at the time, and others to, well, get the space program off the ground, I guess. So we see a focus on the hard sciences, the natural sciences and stuff that can be used directly. Now, this is important. This is obviously something that ties back to American education, about attitudes towards education that we've seen before in the 19th century, when we talked about education being more about training of skills. We need to look at something here that goes back a long time. It's a bit about instrumental reason, it's about instrumental thinking, which means we don't think about the consequences of certain actions and so forth. We just think about, like, how can we use something, how can we go somewhere, and how can we achieve that the best. Now, people like Theodor ADORNO have written about that. Highly recommend reading Dialectics of Enlightenment if you haven't yet, and want to read like a lot of really important stuff, but it's a bit more of a complex text. Here's the short thing, right? The Enlightenment starts somewhere in the 16th century. We have a key text like Francis Bacon's Novum Organon, which looks at the universe as a more mechanical thing, and posits the idea that once we get rid of like all our superstitions and all of that, we realize it's a mechanical system, and we find all the buttons and levers to press and pull and so forth in the universe. We can make it work for us as humans. And that is something that we see throughout, well, the big jumps of science and so forth during the 19th century, with, ideas like positivism coming along and so forth. We see that happening, and it is very successful. And it becomes, in a lot of ways, the guiding principle of a lot of politics and a lot of social understanding that we have. So that's a big deal here, right? And with that fundamental understanding of how education has to work, and the Sputnik shock, we see that that a lot of people are on board with making education work better in that regard, by producing people that can put stuff into space and hopefully defeat the Soviet Union by creating better rockets, weapons, and so forth. That's one side where we see the sort of like anti-communist Cold War ethics kind of playing into the hand of what is going to happen. So we need to improve education, or the US needs to improve education to produce these kind of people in the best way possible, the fastest way possible. If we assume now that neoliberalism is not exactly unpopular at the time, clearly the way to do that is by fully commodifying education and turning it into a fully uncontrolled market where everyone, because that will produce the best results, according to neoliberalism, which obviously doesn't work. But it's definitely a way to sell this at the time. Another part that we see obviously during that time is the Cold War, and of course the Vietnam War, protests and so forth. Having a broader education at different, universities, oftentimes publicly funded universities. You have a lot of younger people who maybe look at Vietnam and go like, this looks bad. Leads to protests. You know about UC Berkeley. There's a lot of stuff about like Columbia University being one of those places where a lot of people protest both during the civil rights movement and of course the anti-war movement during the 60s in a lot of ways. And that is obviously unpopular with certain people in power, both Republicans and Democrats. Generally people that are on board with doing that war thing over there are not happy with people protesting. So there's a second motivation to keep a tighter control or change the education system by maybe reducing publicly funded universities, making it more difficult for people to go there and study in a lot of ways. Ronald Reagan, being, governor of California, is certainly on the forefront of that, but he's not alone. And I think it's important to understand that in places like this is not just party politics. Attacking the more broader education system at the time is a project that all elites on both sides of the two-party system are happily engaging in, right? What we see here is a sort of like almost schizophrenic approach to education already developing. On the one hand, when universities like Bob Jones University get their tax status revoked because of, their refusal to desegregate. Well, they finally did later on, but, that is seen as an attack on free education. On the other hand, hitting hard on student protesters and reducing or attacking publicly funded universities is clearly something that people are on board with. For that, we see a very specific shift, and this is where the sort of like anti-elitist sort of strand of historic anti-intellectualism is in a lot of ways used and utilized by the elites, by looking at student protesters as entitled, as out of touch, tying them more towards the humanities. For all kinds of reasons, humanities students might have a broader sort of like higher level of ability to do intellectual labor and come up with critiques in some ways, but we're very much generalizing here from now. But that is how that sort of is shifted during the 60s. People that are progressive or protesting are already sort of pushed into the box of being humanities students. Obviously, gender studies is not exactly a big thing in the 1960s. It becomes something in the 70s, but they're already getting blamed for having these ideas, right? And they are slowly pushed to be seen as the elite. And it's important. It's possible to do that because during the 19th century, going to Europe and having a classical education, which is often about philosophy, literature, all of these parts of humanities, has already been seen as something the richer elite is doing in Europe and then obviously in places like Yale and Harvard and so forth. So by reconnecting those or reviving these 19th century stereotypes, it is possible to brand specifically progressive humanities students, professors, and so forth, academics, as an out-of-touch elite that is also clearly not exactly producing anything of valor, of value, because clearly studying philosophy does not help with putting people on the moon and building more weapons. Or maybe they are important, but we're trying to keep that out of the way because of, the whole instrumental reason thing that I mentioned for a second ago. So we see those things happening at the same time. And now we are commodifying education fully, slowly privatizing more and more of the education system. And to do that, to be able to, especially to be able to do that, we need to also standardize it and quantify things. See, if we want to sell stuff, it's good to have numbers we can use for that. And that's something that, once again, is sort of like a result of the long march of, Enlightenment through positivism and so forth, that has always had some good and some negative side effects. The idea of standardizing things is big there, right? So if we want to, commodify education, people have to pay for education and also want to pick the best education they can get, we need to have ways of telling them what is the best education they can get. What we do for that is, of course, we start to push standardized testing. Now, standardized testing is not necessarily a bad thing in some areas, right? It's fairly easy to do standardized tests when it comes to mathematics. Fairly easy. It's not completely easy. There are obviously things in there as well, but you get like a bunch of equations, you solve them or you don't solve them. It's fairly easy to go like, well, you got this much success and so forth. So in some areas, once again, they nicely dovetail with the more prestigious sciences at the time, right? Standardizing testing is easy. Once we come to the humanities, this is more difficult. How do you quantify the learning success in, say, English literature or in philosophy or anything of the sorts? Well, by reducing the understanding of text to stuff that can be tested and queried with like simple questions and answers that can be validated as correct or incorrect. So you start asking for things that are written on the page, like what's the name of said character, all of these kind of things that can be quantified in that regard. Now, the result of this is, of course, that it leads to a very specific approach to reading and understanding. See, learning in an academic context is very often learning how to pass tests and become better at tests. That's a skill that you learn during your education in, high school, college, and so forth. So if grades depend on, succeeding at standardized tests, that's what people do. The problem is, of course, that intellectual labor is not about reading a text and remembering specific facts that you can then drop when it comes to history, like when was which battle, how many soldiers were in which army. But intellectual labor is more about connecting ideas. It's more about questioning facts. It's more about looking at how one fact fits into a larger context. And these things are very hard to, test through standardized testing. So they fall to the wayside during this push of commodifying education and standardizing things in that regard. And if you do that all the time at, say, your high school level and so forth, it's very difficult to shift from that to, higher education and universities. And even there, you do the standardized testing thing, which leads to, less skills for intellectual labor being taught. Obviously, the next part, by commodifying education, means that a lot of people won't be able to afford a really, really good education because you put market prices on that stuff. The thing that is important when you commodify something and turn something into a unregulated market happens. Is of course that people that already have enough capital to sort of shape that market will do that, which is exactly what happens during that long time. And the financial elites and the economic elites and other groups with certain levels of, with a lot of capital, this includes obviously Christian evangelical groups as well, will dominate that market, or that education market, because it is, as I said, unregulated. All right, so this leads to an education system that is even more fucked than it was before, in a lot of ways. And it makes it very difficult to, accrue the skills that allow you to do intellectual labor. There's one final step, though, that we need to go to see why all of this is so incredibly bad. See, in the humanities, what we also see is a specialization, because if all of the education system is now a competitive market, each university also needs to, have things that make them, compete against other universities, schools, and so forth, which means further and further specializing different chairs and study programs and so forth. Also, obviously, it means offering things that are that bring in money, like having a really important, sports team, having all kinds of other stuff that kind of makes it more and more difficult to have that broad education that allows you to, engage in intellectual labor. So that's the first part that we see. The next important part is, of course, that while, doing the humanities stuff and doing what is broadly seen as intellectual, and is already maligned as being elitist and out of touch, is unfortunately necessary in one important way, and that is when it comes to judging other parts of science, asking questions, connecting things, looking at consequences of decisions, and so forth. By which I mean, to have a working and successful system of science education when it comes to natural sciences and so forth, you kind of need an understanding, a broader understanding of what these specific sciences do, how they work, all of that kind of stuff. I try to avoid the term critical thinking because it gets thrown around in a lot of ways, and I really don't want to define more terms right now, but it kind of boils down to these specific aspects. Not having the skills to engage in intellectual labor makes it very difficult to judge the validity of specific forms of science or the critique of specific results of science. And this is, of course, where we come to the point where even scientists that, do climate science or vaccine research and can be publicly questioned, pushed also into that direction of, they're just like academic elites, because the step from intellectual elites to academic elites is a very small one. And that allows then, if you reach the point where you also, you are in power and you own the courts, and you have reached all of these things that this alliance of the far right, the Christian right, and the billionaire class, once they have all of these levers in their hands, they can dismantle the entire system, because education clearly works on a state level, on a market level. We all know that. There are very few people left who are able to really judge the quality of certain aspects of science, and that's when you can put the boot down and you can dismantle the Department of Education and you can threaten to withhold funding from elite universities and so forth. The problem here is, of course, that's not good for technology or anything of the sorts. So why is this happening? Clearly, your business elites need highly trained workers and so forth, right? Even Donald Trump has agreed that they need to hire MIT people to do air controlling, to become air traffic controllers. It's not going to work. Here's the thing. Fascists, Christian fascists, that is, and of course, just white supremacists, fascists, and so forth, are very much radicals. Their goal is not to actually make a country succeed globally and so forth. Christian fascists and certain parts of the Christian right are actively waiting for the end of the world. We can't talk about all of that stuff right now, but they basically want the rapture to happen as soon as possible. They don't see the need to start to compete, to keep working on more science, because if the world ends in like 10 years or whenever, why bother? They don't have any sort of interest in that. But they're also highly motivated. And what we've learned over the centuries is that if business interests ally with fanatics of one shape or another, after a while those fanatics will take over, because they don't mind burning the whole thing down. And I would argue that's kind of where we are right now. That's what we see right now. So this is where I bring this all to an end. I hope through the last 2 and a bit hours, I've explained why anti-intellectualism has a long tradition in America, a specific tradition in American history, how throughout the last 50, 60, 70 years, after a period of, better education and so forth, an alliance of business interests and right-wing interests and Christian fundamentalist evangelical interests has managed to roll back the education system and other parts through, using these tools of anti-intellectualism, creating a situation where very few people have the actual abilities to engage in intellectual labor because the education system has been so thoroughly dismantled, which leads to all kinds of consequences downstream when it comes to scientific literacy and so forth. And they're to blame. That's my point. Why is this important? Well, when we argue about bringing this home to the book talk and so forth thing, when we argue in a bookish community that people are reading the wrong books, that people are not engaging in deep criticism, that people are all of these things, what we're seeing is, what we should be seeing or understanding is that this is the result of a long, ongoing strategy that has all kinds of other, negative effects. And frankly, the ability of reading romantasy or enjoying romantasy and not, fucking Russian classics, I guess. All of these things are fairly minor compared to something else. They are symptoms and nothing more. And what I'm trying to do here, and what I'm trying to urge all of you to do in the bookish sphere, right, is when you see something like that, and you think that that people are obviously not engaging in intellectual labor in one way or another, these people are not anti-intellectual. They are people that have been forced by concerted, activities, anti-intellectual activities. They have been forced to live in a state, in a situation where they can't necessarily engage in deeper intellectual labor. So blaming those individuals is wrong. What you need to do is understand the systems that have led to the place where we are and try to come up with ways of changing the world where more people have the ability to engage in intellectual labor. How do we do that? Well, obviously, global revolution, clearly that's the best way. But if that's not happening, I think there are political ways of sort of fighting back, and of fighting back against, library defunding, or fighting back against book bans, fighting back on all of these levels, go into school boards, all that kind of stuff. And if you have the ability to teach, if you have knowledge, if you have skills, maybe make them available to others, whether it is teaching evening classes, whether it is making educational YouTube videos, whether it's anything else of that sort. If you can teach people that can't afford the kind of education that you have had, help them out. That's something direct you can do right now. I've tried to do something like that here, and I try to do that in some of my videos when I do a sort of like deeper sort of like discussion of individual texts, because I believe that almost every text can be engaged with within a deeper intellectual level. I've tried to do that. And in an upcoming video, I will look at the book sphere in particular, because there's something more going on there that I think is also worth talking about. But for now, that's where I want to leave this. So yeah, if you think that anti-intellectualism is real, and you think I'm wrong, then I urge you to actually tell me why I'm wrong by, well, not using, vibes, but actually coming up with examples, by coming up with clear, sources, that kind of stuff. Let's do the sort of like intellectual thing here, right, for a moment, because, I think that's worthwhile doing. And yeah, I'm glad it's over. I hope you enjoyed this, at least some. Thank you so much for sticking with me. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Share this with friends, with enemies. Join the Patreon if you want to support me. Join the channel if you want to support me. Argue with me in the comments. Do whatever else you want to do, and maybe help other people with gaining more understanding, skills, and knowledge. That's the best thing we can do. I'll go and get hammered and drunk at a heavy metal festival now, and I'll talk to you about something else very soon. And until then, thanks and cheers.